The platform was empty by the time the last lantern inside the station house went dark. Evelyn Hartwell had been sitting on her suitcase for nearly 2 hours when she finally allowed herself to understand what had happened. Not suspected, not feared, understood. The man who had written her 17 letters, careful, deliberate letters, full of promises about wide land and a good life and a house that needed a woman's hand, had simply not come. No note left with the station master, no message sent ahead. Nothing. Just the wind moving across the platform boards, and the sound of her own breathing, and the particular silence that only exists when a person realizes they have been discarded. She was 31 years old. She had sold nearly everything she owned to buy the ticket west. If you have ever sat in a place where you were supposed to be wanted and realized you were not, you already know what the next few minutes felt like for her. This is the story of what happened after that. Subscribe to this channel and stay until the very end, because the frontier does not give easy answers, and neither does this story. Hit the like button and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The Wyoming wind in late October did not negotiate. It came off the mountains in long, flat waves that found every gap in a person's clothing, and Evelyn had been standing on the platform of Harlow Creek Station long enough that she had stopped feeling her fingers inside her gloves. The station master, a squat man named Greer with a gray beard he clearly did not tend to, had already told her twice that the last westbound train had gone, that there was a Mo hotel in Harlow Creek worth the name, and that the livery down the road closed at sundown. He told her a third time when he came to lock up the station building. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, but with the blunt economy of a man who had his own fire to get to, "I can't leave you inside. Policy." "I understand," Evelyn said. She did not argue. She had learned early in life that arguing with men who held the keys accomplished nothing useful. She picked up her suitcase, stood, and moved to the far end of the platform where a small wooden overhang offered at least the suggestion of shelter. The station master watched her for a moment, then went inside and locked the door. She heard the bolt slide home. That sound, small, final, almost apologetic in its quietness, was the sound of a door closing on every plan she had made for the past 4 months. Evelyn set the suitcase down and sat on it. She pulled her coat tighter, though it was not a coat built for Wyoming in October. It was a coat built for Philadelphia in November, which was a meaningfully different thing. She had bought it secondhand from a woman on Callow Hill Street who assured her it was good wool. It was adequate wool. Adequate wool and Wyoming wind were not compatible. She did not cry. She thought about it, considered it the way a person considers whether to open a door when they already suspect what is on the other side, and decided against it. There was no one to see, which meant crying would only spend the energy she needed to stay warm. She thought about Arthur Hale instead. Arthur Hale was the name of the man who had not come for her. She had his letters in her coat pocket, folded small, because she had carried them there since she boarded the train in Philadelphia and had not yet figured out what to do with them. He had described himself as a widower of 42 with a cattle operation outside Harlow Creek, honest work and honest intentions, looking for a capable woman who was not afraid of hard country. He had described his land as having good grass and reliable water. He had written in his third letter that he had not laughed since his wife passed 3 years prior, and that he thought perhaps a new arrangement might bring something back into the house. That letter was the one that decided her. Not the promise of the land or the word capable, which she had heard applied to herself so many times it had become a kind of insult dressed as a compliment. It was the admission about not having laughed. A man who was willing to put that in a letter to a woman he had never met was either extraordinarily honest or desperately lonely, and either way, she had understood him immediately. She had written back the same afternoon. She understood now that she had made a significant error in judgment. The cold was getting serious. She stood up, walked the length of the platform twice to push blood back into her feet, and looked out at the dark road beyond the station. Harlow Creek itself was barely a town, a main street with a general store and a livery and a handful of buildings, most of them unlit now. The mountains sat behind it all, enormous and indifferent. She was trying to calculate, in a practical way, how cold it was going to get before morning, and whether adequate wool was sufficient for it when she heard the horse. Not close at first, just hoofbeats coming down the road from the north, unhurried, the way a man rides when he knows the territory and has no particular urgency. Then the horse came past the station fence, and the rider pulled up short when the movement on the platform apparently caught his eye. He was a big man, she could see that even in the poor light, broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas coat that had seen considerable use. He sat the horse easy, the way men sit horses when they have been doing it since childhood and have never had to think about it. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Evelyn looked back. She was not by nature a woman who waited for other people to set the terms of a conversation. "I'm not in distress," she said, which was not entirely true but felt important to establish. The man tilted his head slightly, as if this were an unusual opening. "Didn't say you were," he said. His voice was level, the kind of voice that didn't change much regardless of what it was saying. "It's cold, though." "I'm aware." "You waiting on somebody?" She considered lying. It would have been simpler, but standing on an empty platform at 9 o'clock at night with a suitcase and a coat that was losing the argument with the weather, there was a limit to what a person could plausibly claim. "No," she said. "Not anymore." The man looked at her a moment longer. Then he swung down off the horse in one motion, tied the reins to the fence post, and came up onto the platform. Up close, he was perhaps 35, with a face that showed more weather than age. Deep lines around the eyes, jaw rough with several days of growth, the kind of dark that comes from working outdoors in all seasons. He took off his hat when he stepped under the overhang, which surprised her. "Wade Callahan," he said. "My ranch is about 4 miles out." "Evelyn Hartwell." "You've got nowhere to go tonight." It was not a question. She found she did not resent him for that. He was simply reading what was in front of him, and there was a difference between a man who stated facts bluntly and one who used them as weapons. "It appears that way," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the suitcase, then at her face, and whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes was not visible to her. Then he said, "You can come out to the ranch. There's a spare room. No strings attached to that offer." "You don't know me." "No, but I know what it looks like when a person's been left somewhere." He picked up her suitcase before she could respond. "My horse can carry the bag. It's not far." She should have been more cautious. She knew it even in the moment. A woman alone, accepting an invitation from an unknown man, in the dark, in territory she did not know. Every instinct she had been raised with said that this was precisely how women ended up in worse situations than the ones they were already in. But there was something in the directness of him, the fact that he had not smiled too much or explained himself too thoroughly or tried to convince her of anything, that settled some deep alarm in her. Men with bad intentions, in her experience, worked harder at seeming harmless. Wade Callahan did not seem to care very much about seeming anything. "All right," she said. He handed her his coat without asking whether she wanted it, just held it out and waited. It was heavy, and it smelled like horses and wood smoke and cold air, and she put it on. It came down past her knees. He appeared unbothered by the temperature in just his shirt and vest, which told her something about what he was accustomed to. The walk to where he'd left the horse was short. He tied her suitcase to the saddle, and they set off down the road, him leading the horse by the bridle rather than riding, which she also had not expected. "You were in town for a reason," he said. It was not a prying question, more the kind of thing a person says when they are making conversation, but mean it as an opening rather than a demand. "I came to meet someone," she said, "a man named Arthur Hale. We'd arranged a marriage." The silence that followed was the careful kind. "I know Hale," Wade said finally. Something in his voice told her she did not want to hear the rest of it, but she asked anyway. "And?" He took another few steps before answering. "He sold his cattle operation 3 weeks ago, left the valley." He paused. "I didn't know he had arrangements pending." She absorbed this. Sold his operation and left the valley. 3 weeks ago, which meant he had known, when her last letter arrived, exactly what he was planning. He had said nothing. He had simply allowed her to spend her savings on a train ticket and make a journey of more than 2,000 miles and sit down on a cold platform and wait. "I see," she said. That was all. Wade did not offer sympathy or elaboration, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. There was nothing to say about Arthur Hale that would improve the situation, and he seemed to understand that. The road north out of Harlow Creek was rough. The kind of road that exists because people need it to exist rather than because anyone has maintained it. They walked in quiet, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. The mountains to the west were dark shapes against a sky that still held some faint light, and the land around them was open in all directions, which was itself a thing she had not accustomed herself to. In Philadelphia, there was always something on all sides: buildings, people, noise, the sense of being enclosed and accounted for. Out here, the space went on until it stopped making sense. She was cold, despite the coat. Her feet were hurting. She was calculating in the back of her mind what options she had and finding the list shorter than she would have liked. She had enough money left to get home, but home was a rented room in a boarding house where she was already 3 weeks behind on payments, and a job at a milliner's shop that had already replaced her when she gave notice. She had a sister in Maryland who had 4 children and a husband who barely managed to be pleasant to his own family. She had, in other words, nowhere obvious to return to. She had spent 4 months building toward this. She had told herself over and over that the letters were enough evidence of a real person with real intentions, and she had been wrong about that in a way that was going to cost her something she could not easily name. "You lived here long?" she asked, because thinking about Arthur Hale and her own poor judgment was not productive. "Born here," Wade said. "My father ran cattle on the same land. I took it over when he got too old for it." "You run it alone?" A pause. "I have 2 hands. Older men, both of them, been there since before I can remember. They've got a cabin on the property." She noticed he did not answer the question she had actually asked. "That's not what I meant." He glanced at her sideways. "No," he said. "I run it alone, in the way you meant." The ranch came into view around a long bend in the road, not visible so much as discernible, a cluster of dark shapes that resolved, as they got closer, into a house and a barn and several smaller structures. There was a light in the barn window. The house itself was dark. Wade took her inside through the front door, lit the lamp on the kitchen table, and made the fire in the front room without ceremony or instruction. While he did, she looked around. The kitchen was functional and utterly without decoration. No curtains on the windows, nothing hanging on the walls. The kind of cleanliness that comes not from care, but from there being very little in the room to get dirty. A man's house, by which she meant a house where someone lived alone and had stopped seeing the walls. There was a coffee pot on the stove. He filled it and set it to heat. "The spare room is at the end of the hall," he said. "Bed's made up. It's cold in there tonight, probably. There are blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed." "Thank you," she said. He nodded, poured coffee for both of them without asking, and sat down at the kitchen table. She sat across from him. The coffee was strong in the way that ranch coffee is always strong, like it was made by people who needed to wake up at 4 in the morning in all weather and could not afford anything tentative. She wrapped both hands around the cup. They sat in silence for a few minutes, which she did not feel the need to fill. She had noticed that he didn't seem to feel that need either, and she found this restful rather than strange. Most men, in her experience, filled silence because they were uncomfortable in it. Wade Callahan sat in it like he owned it. "What will you do?" he asked eventually. Not unkindly, just directly. "I don't know yet," she said, which was the honest answer. "I need to think." He accepted this. "You can stay here while you figure it out. The offer's not complicated." She looked at him. "Why?" He considered the question seriously, which she had not entirely expected. "Because it's the right thing," he said. "And because the ranch is—" He stopped, seemed to choose his words. "I've been here a long time by myself. It could use some ordering up." She did not know what to do with that exactly, so she let it sit. They finished the coffee. He showed her the spare room. It was small and plain and had a single window that looked out toward the barn, and a bed that was, as he had said, made up, though the quilt on it had seen many years of use. She noticed the chest at the foot of the bed and did not open it yet. She noticed the hook on the back of the door for hanging clothes. Wade said good night and left. She heard his footsteps down the hall, then a door closed quietly. She sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on. For a long moment she did not move. She was tired in the total way, not just her body, but some deeper mechanism that had been running at high tension for months, and had now, in the absence of immediate crisis, begun to notice how exhausted it was. She thought about the platform. She thought about Arthur Hale's letters in her coat pocket, the careful handwriting, the promises that had turned out to cost him nothing because he had never intended to keep them. She took the letters out and held them for a moment. Then she put them in the bottom of her suitcase, under everything else. She would deal with what they meant at some point, but not tonight. Tonight, she was going to sleep beside a warm stove for the first time in weeks, and that was going to have to be enough. She pulled open the chest at the foot of the bed and found 3 blankets, all of them heavy. She took all 3. She woke before dawn, which had been her habit for years, and lay still for a moment trying to remember where she was. Then she did remember, and she got up. The house was quiet. She found her way to the kitchen, where the fire from the night before had burned down to coals. She built it back up. She knew how to do this, had done it in the boarding house in Philadelphia every winter morning, and found the coffee supplies and started a pot. While it heated, she looked around the kitchen more carefully than she had the night before. The pantry had supplies, but they were disorganized in the way of someone who stocked things when he thought of it rather than by any system. Flour in one corner, coffee beside it, a sack of dried beans on the floor, salt on a high shelf. She could see by the way things were arranged exactly what kind of man Arthur Hale's letters had never been written by. Wade Callahan was someone who kept what he needed and used what he kept and did not think about it much beyond that. She found eggs and fatback and made breakfast. Not because she felt she owed it, but because she was awake and the materials were there, and she was someone who, when confronted with a kitchen and an empty stove, found it nearly impossible not to cook in it. She was cutting the fatback when she heard boots in the hallway. Wade came into the kitchen already dressed, hat in hand, and stopped when he saw the pan on the stove and Evelyn standing at the table. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I was awake." He sat down at the table and did not argue further, which she appreciated. When the food was ready, she set a plate in front of him and one at her own place, and they ate. He ate the way he did everything, without wasted motion, attentive to what was in front of him. "The hands come by for breakfast sometimes," he said. "Gus and Fenwick. They tend to show up early." "How early?" "Already missed them today." She looked up. Outside the window, the sky was getting light. She had assumed she woke before dawn. Apparently not. "What time is it?" she asked. 5:30. He picked up his coffee. "They'll have fed already. They don't mind." She filed this away. The hours of a working ranch were different from anything she had operated within before. She would need to adjust. She was thinking about this when the sound of boots on the porch came from outside, followed by 2 solid knocks. Wade called out, "Come in," without getting up, and the door opened to admit 2 men, one old enough to have a completely white beard and the kind of posture that spoke of a lifetime of outdoor work, the other, perhaps 50, with a narrow face and watchful eyes. Both of them stopped when they saw Evelyn. The white-bearded one looked at Wade. "This is Evelyn Hartwell," Wade said. "She'll be staying for a time." Gus, she assumed this was Gus because something in his manner suggested it, looked at Wade with an expression that said several things simultaneously without saying any of them. Then he nodded at Evelyn. "Ma'am." The other one, Fenwick, did not nod. He looked at her in the careful, evaluating way of someone who has watched a person walk into a situation and is not yet sure whether they are going to be a problem. Evelyn looked back at him. She was accustomed to men deciding in the first 30 seconds whether she was worth paying attention to, and she had learned that the most effective response was not charm, but composure. "Good morning," she said. Fenwick grunted. Then he looked at the stove, at the pan still on the burner, and said, "Smells right." Gus poured himself coffee from the pot without being invited, which she deduced was a long-established habit. "You staying in Harlow Creek long, Miss Hartwell?" "She came out from the east," Wade said, before she could answer. It was not an answer to the question, but something in his tone suggested the question should stop there for now. Gus, who was clearly accustomed to reading Wade Callahan's tone, let it go. She refilled her coffee and ate the rest of her breakfast and let the conversation move around her. The day's work, a fence that needed mending on the north side, a heifer Gus was concerned about. She listened and learned, because that was what you did when you entered a world you did not yet understand. When Wade pushed back from the table to go, Evelyn said, "What needs doing today?" All 3 men looked at her. "Inside the house," she added, because she could see immediately that suggesting she help with the cattle would have produced a different kind of look. "I can see what wants organizing." Gus looked at Wade again with that same layered expression. Wade said, "Whatever you think needs it." So she organized. She spent the morning taking stock of the pantry and the kitchen and the main room, and she found that there was a great deal that needed doing. Not in the way of filth. Wade kept the place clean, or at least not dirty, but in the way of a space where no one had thought about whether things were where they should be or how a household actually runs when more than one person is living in it. She rearranged the pantry by logical groupings. She found a stack of mending, shirts and work trousers, and 2 sets of canvas gloves with split seams in a box in the corner of the main room and settled in to work through it. She found, in the spare room next to the one she was sleeping in, a trunk of what turned out to be a woman's things: dresses, a pair of good shoes, a sewing kit, old, carefully folded. She closed the trunk and left the room and said nothing about it. By midday, she had a better picture of the ranch than she had expected to get this soon, and she had begun, tentatively, to revise a certain set of conclusions about her situation. She had come west for a new beginning. She had been delivered a humiliation instead. But she was standing in a kitchen that had been organized for the first time in what appeared to be years, beside a fire she had built, having made breakfast for 4 people in a house that was not hers, in country she did not yet know. She was not, she realized, without a path forward. She simply needed to determine whether this particular path was one she was willing to walk. That afternoon, when Wade came in from the fences for water, he found her at the kitchen table with the mending. He looked at the neat stack of repaired garments beside her and did not say anything about them. "How bad is the fence work?" she asked, because she wanted to understand what the ranch actually needed, and she had decided the fastest way to do that was to ask directly. He sat down across from her, drank his water, considered the question seriously. "Needs more hands than I've got," he said. "North quarter will take most of the week. Then there's the water line on the east side that's been giving trouble since August. And you've only got Gus and Fenwick. Hired 2 men last spring, both gone by September." He set down the glass. "It's hard work and it's lonely country. Most men don't stay." She looked at him. "Do you think I'm going to leave?" He met her eyes. There was a quality to his attention that she was getting accustomed to. Direct but not aggressive. The kind of looking that meant he was actually thinking about what she said rather than preparing his response. "I think you'll do what makes sense to you," he said finally. "That's all any of us do." She nodded and went back to the mending. She had decided 2 things by the time the sun went down. First, that Arthur Hale was a coward who had written beautiful letters and then failed to show up for any of it, and she was done spending energy on him. Second, that this ranch, this particular, difficult, lonely, half-ordered piece of Wyoming, had possibilities she had not anticipated. She was not the woman she had been when she stepped off the train. Or rather, she was exactly that woman, which was exactly the problem with how Arthur Hale had thought about her. He had been looking for something soft and grateful to fill a space. He had not understood that what was coming at him was something considerably more complicated. Wade Callahan, she was beginning to think, might understand it better. Not because he had said so, because he hadn't tried to say anything about it at all, and simply watched what she did instead. That evening, she made supper for herself and Wade and the 2 hands, who apparently ate at the main house more evenings than not. Gus complimented the biscuits in a careful, formal way that told her he was trying to be welcoming without being condescending, which she found touching. Fenwick ate 2 helpings and said nothing, which she decided to take as equivalent. After supper, when Gus and Fenwick had gone back to their cabin, Wade stayed at the table while she washed the dishes. The lamp on the table put out steady yellow light. "You mentioned," she said without turning around, "that the ranch needs ordering up." "I did." "I'd like to stay on," she said. "Not as a guest. I'll help with what needs doing." She turned around. "I'm not asking for anything beyond fair arrangement, but I won't sit idle, and I won't pretend I have somewhere better to be." He looked at her for a long moment. "Don't leave," he said. "This ranch needs someone like you." She had heard men say things like that before. Flattering, vague, designed to make a woman feel necessary without actually giving her anything. But Wade Callahan said it the way he said everything else. Straight, without decoration, looking directly at her. He meant, she believed, exactly what he said. Not more, not less. "All right," she said. She turned back to the dishes. Outside, the wind was moving across the valley. The fire in the stove was burning steady. Somewhere beyond the barn, a horse shifted its weight in its stall. Evelyn Hartwell had arrived at a train station with nowhere to go. She was not sure yet what she had arrived at, but But she was beginning to feel, underneath the exhaustion and the practical fury at Arthur Hale and the low, persistent ache of having been made to feel unwanted, something she recognized from other moments in her life. The kind of quiet that settles in when a person has made a decision that is correct, even if it is not easy. She finished the dishes. She put out the lamp in the kitchen. She went down the hall to her room, which was cold, but not as cold as it had been, and she got into bed under all three of the heavy blankets and lay there in the dark. She was still learning the sounds of this place, the way the wind moved differently around a wooden house than around brick, the sound the barn made when the temperature dropped, the particular quiet of country where there were no streetcars, no other buildings, no human sound between you and the mountains. She was already listening for it. By the end of the first week, Evelyn had stopped counting the things that needed doing and started working through them instead. It was the only practical response to the situation. The list was long enough that thinking about it whole produced nothing useful. She had learned that much from the boarding house in Philadelphia, where the landlady had a habit of standing in the kitchen reciting everything that was wrong with the building while none of it got fixed. Evelyn preferred to pick up the nearest problem and handle it and then pick up the next one. It was not a glamorous method. It worked. The pantry was finished by day 2. She found a system that made sense for the way the ranch operated. Dry goods together, canned stores together, the things used daily within reach and the things used rarely pushed to the back. It was not complicated, but it had not been done, and once it was done, a small and persistent friction disappeared from the morning routine. Wade noticed, she could tell, in the way he stopped pausing at the pantry door before he could find what he was looking for. He said nothing about it. She did not need him to. The mending she worked through in the evenings after supper, sitting at the kitchen table while the fire held and the lamp put out its steady light. She had finished the box in the main room by the 4th day and started in on a second pile she found in the bunkhouse, brought over by Gus with the manner of a man who was not sure the offer would be accepted. She accepted it. Fenwick watched this happen with his usual expression of compressed assessment and said nothing, which she had come to understand was not rudeness but his particular form of observation. On the 5th day she found the ledger. It was on the shelf in the main room, between 2 catalogs that had been sitting there long enough to have left rings on the wood below them. She would not have noticed it except that she was dusting the shelf, an activity that had not been performed in some time, and the ledger was pushed so far back it had been nearly invisible behind the catalogs. She pulled it out, looked at the cover. It was stamped with the year 3 years prior, and someone had written Callahan in pencil on the front. She should not have opened it. She did open it. She was not nosy by nature, but she was practical, and the practical question of how the ranch was actually running had been sitting in the back of her mind since the first morning. What she found when she turned the pages was a record of accounts in Wade's handwriting, careful, unhurried handwriting that matched the way he talked. And what the record showed was a ranch that was managing, but barely. Cattle prices had dropped 2 years running. The north fence repair from last spring had cost considerably more than budgeted. There were 2 entries for hired hands. The men Wade had mentioned, gone by September, where the wages listed represented money spent on labor that had not lasted. She closed the ledger and put it back where she found it. She thought about what she had seen for the rest of that day and into the evening, while she was making supper, and while she ate it, and while she washed the dishes after. She thought about what it meant to run a cattle operation with 2 aging hands and a fence situation that needed more labor than was available and cattle prices that were not recovering. She thought about it, and then she put it away, because it was not her business yet, and because there was nothing she could do about it until she understood the ranch better. But she noted it. On the 7th morning, Gus came to the kitchen door before breakfast, which he had not done before. He knocked, which he also had not done before, and when she told him to come in, he came in with his hat in his hands in a way that told her immediately this was not an ordinary visit. "Morning, Miss Hartwell," he said. "Good morning. Sit down. There's coffee." He sat, but he held the hat on his knee rather than setting it down, which was the body language of a man who was not planning to stay long. He accepted the coffee and looked into it. "Fenwick says I should mind my own business," he said. "Fenwick seems like a sensible man," she said, and sat across from him. Gus smiled, which rearranged his face considerably. The white beard moved up and the lines around his eyes deepened in a way that was unexpectedly warm. "He's practical," he said. "It's not always the same thing." He looked at her directly. I want to ask you something, and I'm asking because I've been on this ranch for 22 years, not because I'm trying to pry. Ask, she said. Are you planning to stay? She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Yes, she said. I believe so. He nodded, slowly, still looking at the coffee. Wade hasn't... He stopped, started again. He's a good man. He's been a hard man to work for sometimes, not because he's mean, but because he's been away from himself for a while. Since Margaret. She kept her expression neutral. His wife. 3 years, Gus said. She took a fever, and it went fast. They hadn't been married long, so 4 years, maybe 5. He was different before. He looked up. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for him. I'm telling you because if you're going to be here, you should understand what you're working with. I appreciate that, she said, and meant it. Gus finished his coffee, stood, put his hat back on. He pushed the hands away, last couple of years. Not on purpose, just he stopped making room for anybody. He paused at the door. You don't push easy. I noticed that about you. Then he went out, and Evelyn sat with her empty coffee cup and thought about what he had said, and about the ledger, and about the trunk in the spare room she had not opened again. She had known, at some level, since the first night. The bare walls, the house that was clean but unoccupied in some interior way, the careful distance he maintained even while being genuinely decent. A man who had been somewhere real with someone and lost it, and then pulled back behind the daily mechanics of work and solitude. She knew the shape of grief because she had watched her own father do a version of it after her mother died, and because she had done a version of it herself after circumstances she did not often revisit. The difference was that she had decided at some point to keep moving, not to pretend nothing had happened, but to carry it and walk forward anyway. She was not sure Wade had made that decision yet. She was not sure it was her place to say so. She decided to let the work speak first. The second week was harder than the first in practical terms. One of the 2 horses Wade used for the cattle work threw a shoe and had to be rested, which meant the fence work on the north quarter was running behind. Gus's left shoulder, which he mentioned in passing was an old injury, was giving him trouble in the cold. Fenwick was managing, but Fenwick was 53 and moving hay bales without adequate help, which Evelyn could see from the kitchen window was costing him something he was not going to admit. On the 3rd day of the second week, she put on her coat and went out to the barn. It was her first time inside. The barn was large and not warm, but warmer than outside, and it smelled of horses and dried grass and the particular animal presence that she found not unpleasant. Fenwick was in the back, moving a stack of bales from one side to the other for reasons she did not yet understand. He stopped when he saw her. You need something? He said. What are you moving those for? She asked. He looked at her as if the question were surprising. Making room on the east side for the feed delivery next week. How many bales? He told her. She looked at the stack. I can help shift the lower ones, she said. You're favoring your back on the lift. A long pause. Fenwick had a face that was not built for expressing uncertainty, but uncertainty crossed it now. It's not, he began. I know it's not typical, she said. I'm not a typical situation. Another pause. Then he handed her a pair of heavy canvas gloves from the hook on the wall without further discussion. They worked for an hour and a half. She was not as strong as he was, but she was accurate, and she didn't stop, which meant the work went faster than it would have alone. Fenwick did not talk while they worked, which suited her. By the time they were done, she had a considerably better understanding of how the barn was organized and what the feed situation actually looked like going into winter. Going into winter, it turned out, was not as comfortable as it should have been. She did not say anything about this yet. She filed it. That afternoon, when she came back inside to start supper, Wade was already in the kitchen. He was standing at the window, still in his coat, and she could tell by the set of his shoulders that something had happened. What is it? She said. He turned. He had a letter in his hand, one of those thick envelopes that only come from lawyers or banks, and which never contain anything pleasant. Bank in Cheyenne, he said. They're calling in the note on the north pasture. She absorbed this. She knew from the ledger, from her unauthorized reading of the ledger, that the north pasture carried a mortgage that had been refinanced once already. When? Spring. He put the letter on the table. I've got until March to either pay off the balance or they sell the note. She looked at the letter on the table. She did not pick it up. How much? he told her. It was not an impossible number. It was also not a manageable number on the current earnings of the ranch without some significant change in how things were running. She could see him doing the same calculation she was doing and arriving at the same uncomfortable place. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her. "Please," she said. "Sit down. I'll make coffee and we'll look at this together." He sat down at the kitchen table, which surprised her a little. She had expected resistance, some version of "that's my business and I'll handle it." He sat, and he waited while she made coffee, and when she put the cups on the table and sat across from him, he told her the full picture. The full picture was this: the ranch was running on thin margins because the cattle prices had dropped, and because he'd had to borrow against the north pasture to get through the difficult year 2 years prior. He had 2 aging hands. He had no family left to call on for help. He had been planning to hire on for the coming spring roundup, but the bank letter changed the math. He talked for 20 minutes, which Evelyn suspected was more than he had talked about the ranch's situation to anyone in a long time. She listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both of them practical, and he answered them. When he finished, she said, "You need to sell cattle before March. I know that. And you need to find buyers now, not in spring, because prices will drop further if you wait and take whatever you can get at the last moment." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where he was deciding whether to be surprised that she had tracked him to this conclusion or simply acknowledge that she had. "I know that too," he said. "I've been writing to the buyers in Laramie. The prices they're offering aren't what I need." "What about Casper, or the Eastern buyers, the Chicago buyers?" He was quiet for a moment. "The Chicago buyers work through agents. You need an introduction to get the good prices. I don't have the connection." She thought about this. "The man who sold out, Hale," she said. "He was dealing with someone. He mentioned it in his letters." She did not enjoy using Arthur Hale's letters for anything, but she was a practical woman. He mentioned a broker in Cheyenne. Someone named, she thought, Norris. He dealt with Eastern buyers. Wade's eyes shifted slightly. "I know the name Norris," he said. "He's real. The question is whether he'll deal with a ranch this size." "Write and ask," she said. "The worst he can say is no." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind was picking up and something rattled against the side of the house. A loose board somewhere, another item for the list. "You read the ledger," he said. It was not an accusation, just a statement quietly made. She did not deny it. "Yes," she said. "I found it on the shelf. I shouldn't have, but I did." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did you think?" "I thought the ranch is in a difficult position that isn't the result of bad management," she said. "It's the result of bad luck 2 years running and not enough hands." She kept her voice even. "I thought it could be turned around if the cash flow problem gets addressed before spring. And you're telling me this because I'm living here," she said. "Because if the ranch fails, I have nowhere to go either, and I'd rather not go back to Philadelphia." She picked up her coffee. "I'm not being noble about this, Wade. I'm being practical." He looked at the table, then back at her. He stopped. "Most people would have stayed out of it." "Most people would have stayed at the train station," she said. "I didn't. That tells you something about me." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the territory adjacent to one. He picked up the bank letter and folded it in half and put it in his chest pocket. "I'll write to Norris," he said. She nodded and got up to start supper. The letter to the Cheyenne broker went out on a Friday. The following Tuesday, a man arrived at the ranch that no one had sent for. She heard the horse first, not the easy, familiar sound of Gus or Fenwick coming up from the bunkhouse, but a faster pace, a horse pushed rather than walked. She was in the main room at the time, working through the last of the mending, and she went to the window. The man who rode up to the front of the house was perhaps 50, well-dressed for the territory in a coat that cost more than anything hanging in Wade's wardrobe, and he sat his horse with the ease of someone who used horses as transportation rather than as a working tool. He had a dark, trimmed beard and sharp eyes that she could read even at this distance as the kind that were always calculating something. Wade came out of the barn when he heard the horse. She watched the 2 men greet each other, not warmly, she could see that much through the window. Handshake, some words exchanged, and then Wade gestured toward the house. She was back at the mending by the time they came through the door. "Evelyn," Wade said, "this is Douglas Mercer. He manages the Harlow Creek Land Company." She looked up. "Mr. Mercer." Mercer looked at her with a quick assessment that she recognized as the kind men perform when a woman appears in a space they did not expect her. His expression did not change, but she could see the adjustment happening. "Miss Hartwell," she said. "Miss Hartwell." He turned back to Wade. "I won't take much of your time. I heard you got a letter from the bank in Cheyenne." The room went very still. Evelyn did not look up from the mending, but she listened with complete attention. Wade said, "News travels." "In a valley this size, yes it does." Mercer took off his hat, held it in both hands. "I'm here because the land company has an interest in the North Pasture. Always has. If you're in a position where selling makes sense, we'd like to be the first conversation." Wade was quiet for a moment. "I'm not selling." "Wade." Mercer's voice was patient, which was worse, Evelyn thought, than if he had been impatient. Patience in that tone meant he had done this before. "The land company can offer you fair market value and let you clear the debt. You keep the main property, the house, the grazing rights on the east side. You lose the north quarter, but you lose the debt with it." "The north quarter is the best grazing land I have," Wade said. "The north quarter is the land the bank is going to take in March if you don't move," Mercer said. "At least this way you control the terms." Evelyn set down the mending. She did this quietly, but Mercer noticed, and his eyes moved to her with a particular kind of attention, the kind that wondered what she was doing. "What does the land company want with North Pasture grazing land?" she asked. Mercer looked at her. He took a half-second too long to answer, which told her something. "The company's expanding its holdings. It's a sound investment. The North Quarter has the Harlow Creek tributary running through it," she said, "the one that feeds the east side properties." Another half-second. "That's right. So whoever holds the North Quarter controls the water access for a significant portion of the valley," she said. She said it pleasantly, in the tone of someone simply following a line of reasoning to its end. "That seems like more than a grazing investment." Mercer looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, and then looked back at Wade. "You're—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Your guest has a sharp mind." "She does," Wade said. "The offer stands regardless," Mercer said. "You have until the bank's deadline. Think it over." He put his hat back on. "Good day, Miss Hartwell." He went out. They heard the horse depart, and then the sound faded, and they were left in the quiet of the main room. Wade looked at her. "He knows about the bank letter," she said. "He knew fast." "Yes," Wade said. "The land company and the Cheyenne Bank," she said. "Do you know if there's a connection?" Wade sat down in the chair across from her. He ran one hand back through his hair, which was something he did, she had noticed, when he was thinking hard about something he did not want to think about. "I don't know," he said, "but I don't like coincidences." "Neither do I." She picked the mending back up. Her hands were steady. "Don't agree to anything yet." "I wasn't going to." "I know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." He looked at her with that expression again, the one that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "You've been here 2 weeks," he said. "You're involved in my business to a degree I didn't anticipate." "Yes," she said. "I am." She kept sewing. "I told you when I asked to stay, I don't sit idle." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not complaining." Outside, the afternoon was getting colder. The wind was building from the north again, which Gus had told her that morning meant weather was coming. The weather came 3 days later. It was not the worst storm the valley had seen, but it was serious. A driving sleet that turned to snow by nightfall and came down hard enough that by morning the ranch was under 6 inches with more falling. Wade and the two hands were out before first light dealing with the cattle, getting them into the sheltered area along the west side of the barn where the overhang gave some protection. Evelyn stayed in the house and did what was useful from inside. She kept the fires going. She kept hot food ready for when they came in. She tracked the temperature drop by the way the windows behaved and kept the pipes from freezing by running water in the kitchen at intervals. When Gus came in at midday, shaking ice off his coat and moving his shoulder with the careful blankness of someone in real pain, she sat him down and made him hold a hot compress against it without asking his opinion on the matter. "You're bossy," he said, but not unkindly. "My landlady in Philadelphia said the same thing," she said, The pipes didn't freeze in her building for 7 years either. He laughed, which was brief but genuine. By mid-afternoon, Fenwick came in and said the north fence had a section down. The sleet had loaded a dead tree on the fence line, and the weight had taken out 20 feet of posts. Wade was out there now, with wire and tools, but the ground was freezing and setting new posts in it was going to be a problem. Evelyn thought for a moment. The cattle on the north end? How many? Fenwick looked at her. 40, maybe 45. If the fence is down, they'll drift north, she said. That takes them toward Mercer's land. Fenwick's expression sharpened in a way that told her she had understood the problem correctly. I'll go back out, he said. Take the rope from the barn. The long one on the west wall. You can string a temporary line with the fence posts you already have until Wade gets the ground broken. He looked at her for a moment with that compressed, evaluating look. Then he took the rope and went back out. She was not sure whether what she had suggested was correct. She had been watching the fence work from the distance available to her and had formed some ideas about how it operated, but she was not a rancher, and she knew it. What she had was a logical mind and enough information to form reasonable guesses. She hoped the guesses were right. They were, mostly. By evening, the cattle were contained and the fence had a temporary line that would hold until the ground thawed enough for proper post work. Wade came in after dark looking like a man who had been standing in a storm for 10 hours. Which was because he had been. He was cold in the bone-deep way that takes time to come back from, and she made him sit by the fire and put a bowl of stew in front of him and did not make conversation while he ate. When he had eaten, and the color had come back into his face to some degree, he looked up. Fenwick said you told him about the rope. It seemed like the right thing, she said. Was it? It was. He looked at her steadily. How did you know about the drift? You mentioned the north fence and the Mercer land boundary in the same conversation, she said. And cattle drift downwind in a storm. If the fence is down and the wind is coming from the north, they'd move south. But the gap was on the north side, which means if the fence is angled correctly, the drift goes... She stopped. I don't actually know enough about how the fence line runs to be sure. I just thought if cattle were going to end up somewhere you didn't want them, Mercer's land seemed like the most inconvenient option. He was quiet for a moment. You're right about the angle, he said. They would have gone onto his land, and then there would have been an argument about it, she said, given the timing. He looked at the fire. Given the timing, he agreed. The storm continued through the night. The ranch was intact. The cattle were contained. The temporary fence line held until morning when the work could be done properly. None of it was heroic. It was just work. The kind of constant, unglamorous, specific work that keeps a place running when everything is pushing against it. Evelyn understood this kind of work. She had been doing it all her life in various forms, mostly in conditions that did not reward it and for people who did not notice it. Here, at least, the work had a direct relationship to the outcome. She could see the fence and the cattle and the fire and the pipes, and she could see what happened when the work was done and what would happen if it wasn't. There was a clarity to it she had not expected to find. On the morning after the storm, when the snow was still on the ground, but the sleet had stopped and the sky was thin and pale and cold, she went to the north fence with Wade to help assess the damage. She did not ask permission. She put on every warm thing she had, borrowed a pair of Gus's work gloves because hers were inadequate, and went. Wade looked at her when she came out of the house but did not say anything about it. They walked to the north fence together in the snow. The damage was more extensive than the temporary repair had revealed. 20 feet of posts was the conservative estimate, closer to 35 in the clear morning light, and the tree that had come down on it had damaged the wire beyond what could be easily restrung. Wade stood looking at it with his hands on his hips. I need posts, he said. More than I have on hand. What does the general store carry? Not enough. I'd have to order from Cheyenne. She looked at the broken section. How long to get here? Week, maybe 10 days. You can't leave this section open for 10 days, she said. No, he agreed. She thought. Mercer's timber lease, she said. He holds the logging rights east of the valley. I heard Gus mention it. He does. He wants your north pasture, she said. That's a negotiating point. Temporary access to post timber in exchange for an extension on the conversation. Wade turned and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not surprise. He had stopped being surprised by her some days ago. Something more complex than that. "You're using his interest in the property against him," he said. "I'm using the fact that he needs your goodwill to get what he wants," she said. "Which is true regardless of whether you ever sell him anything. He's more likely to accommodate a neighbor he's still negotiating with than one who's told him no outright." She looked at the fence. "It's just practical." He looked at the fence too for a moment. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "Where did you learn to think like this?" She considered the question. "Philadelphia," she said finally. "I spent 11 years working for a woman who ran a millinery shop and also managed 4 separate property disputes, 2 of them against men who thought she wouldn't understand the legal terms. She understood all of them." She pulled the borrowed gloves tighter. "She taught me that understanding a situation better than the other person is the most useful thing a woman can have." Wade was quiet for a moment. "What happened to her?" "She died," Evelyn said. 2 years ago. That's when I decided to try somewhere else." She looked at the broken fence posts. "I should have perhaps tried somewhere with a more reliable correspondent." It was the first thing approaching a joke she had made about the whole situation. She heard it land, and then she heard Wade make a sound. Brief, low, not quite a laugh, but something in that direction. It was, she thought, possibly the first time she had heard him make that sound at all. She filed it quietly, alongside everything else she was learning about this place. They walked the full fence line before going back. She took notes in her head. The places where the wire was old and wearing, the posts that had heaved in the frost, the places where the terrain worked against the fence design. She did not know yet what to do with all of it, but she had learned, in 11 years with a woman who thought in property disputes, that information was the most valuable thing and that collecting it cost nothing. On the way back to the house, the sun broke through the cloud cover for the first time in days. It was thin, pale winter sun, the kind that gives light without warmth, but it made the snow on the ground catch and the valley opened up in front of them, white and wide and cold and very, very large. Evelyn stopped walking for a moment. She had not in 2 weeks really looked at the land itself. She had been too busy looking at what was immediately in front of her: the kitchen, the barn, the fence, the ledger. Mercer's face when she asked about the water rights. She had been in the territory without being present to it. Standing on the snow-covered hill above the damaged fence, with the cold cutting through every layer she had on, she looked at the valley that spread out below the ranch and understood, for the first time, what Wade had been protecting all these years. It was not just the banknote or the cattle prices or the grazing land. It was this, exactly this, the particular shape of this particular piece of earth. She understood it in a way she had not expected to. "It's something," she said, which was not the most eloquent thing she had ever said, but was accurate. Beside her, Wade was also looking at the valley. "Yes," he said, "it is." They stood there for a moment, which was longer than either of them had stood still together at the same time since the first night in the kitchen. Then the cold became insistent again, and they walked back to the house, and she made coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and began composing the letter to Douglas Mercer about the timber. She did not read over his shoulder. She had already said what she had to say about it. That evening she sat by the fire and thought about the ledger and the bank and Mercer and the fence and the water rights and the broker in Cheyenne who had not yet written back. She thought about the valley and the thin winter sun. She thought about Gus's remark, that Wade had stopped making room for anybody, and about the sound he had made that morning, the one that was not quite a laugh. She thought about what it cost a person to stop making room and what it cost to start again. She was not under any illusions about what this situation was. She had come west for a marriage arrangement that had collapsed before it began, and she was living in a man's house under a practical arrangement that was undefined and somewhat irregular by any convention she had been raised within. She had no idea what the valley thought about it, and she suspected she was going to find out sooner or later in whatever way small communities delivered that kind of information. She was not frightened by any of this. She was not even particularly concerned. She had found, somewhere between the train platform and the damaged fence line, that her capacity for concern about what was regular and what was not had been significantly reduced by recent events. What she was useful. She was present. She was here. For a woman who had spent most of her adult life being present in places where nobody particularly needed her, that was not a small thing. The fire settled and shifted. The night pressed against the windows. Somewhere outside, the last of the storm's wind moved across the valley and faded. She picked up the mending again and worked until the lamp began to dim. Mercer's reply to Wade's letter came back in 4 days, which was faster than Evelyn had expected. She was in the kitchen when Wade brought it in from the road, and she watched him read it standing at the table without sitting down, which told her something about his reaction before he said a word. He set it down when he finished and looked at it for a moment, the way a person looks at a thing they want to understand better before responding to it. "He'll give us access to the timber," Wade said. 30 posts, cut and delivered. "And in return?" "He wants a meeting, not about the sale. He's careful about that. He says he just wants to talk about the valley's water situation, the tributary." He looked up. "He says it's a conversation he's been wanting to have with several landholders." Evelyn sat down across from the letter and read it herself. Mercer wrote in a precise hand, the kind learned from someone who understood that a well-composed letter was a tool of persuasion. The words were moderate and reasonable on the surface. Beneath the surface, she could see the architecture of what he was actually doing, building a position, slowly, with each small exchange, the way a man builds a dam one stone at a time, until the water has nowhere to go but where he wants it. "He says several landholders," she said, "but he wrote to you specifically." "Because the North Pasture tributary is the source," Wade said. "Whoever holds that land holds the tap. He knows that. He's always known that." She folded the letter and pushed it back across the table. "Take the timber. Go to the meeting. Don't agree to anything." Wade picked up the letter. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," she said, "but those are still the right steps." He looked at her. There was something different in how he looked at her these days. Not warmer exactly, because he had been decent from the first night. More direct, like a man who had stopped trying to figure out what she was and had started simply paying attention to what she did. "You should come to the meeting," he said. She had not expected that. "It's a landholders' meeting." "You're living on the land," he said, "and you understand what he's doing better than I do, if I'm honest about it." He folded the letter and put it in his chest pocket, where important things went. "I know cattle. I know this valley. I don't know men like Mercer as well as I should. Men like Mercer are men who have decided that having more is more important than being fair about it," she said. "The specific version of that is different in every case. With him, I think it's the water. It's always the water out here, from what I can tell. Whoever controls the water controls everything downstream." "Literally," Wade said, "and figuratively." She got up and went back to the stove. "When is the meeting?" "End of next week, his office in town." "I'll come," she said. The letter from the Cheyenne broker arrived 2 days after Mercer's timber was delivered. Norris, the man Arthur Hale had mentioned in his letters, the one Evelyn had dredged up from a correspondence she would have preferred to forget, wrote back with the particular efficiency of someone who dealt in quantities and had no time for anything decorative. He was interested in the Callahan herd. He had Eastern buyers looking for Wyoming beef, and the prices they were discussing were meaningfully better than what the Laramie buyers had offered. He would need to see a count and a quality assessment before he could make a formal offer. Wade read this letter sitting down, which was a different physical posture than the Mercer letter had produced. He read it twice. "Is this real?" he said. "Read the letterhead," Evelyn said. "It's a legitimate brokerage." "How do you know?" "Because I spent 2 evenings last week writing to a woman I used to know in Philadelphia who dealt in commercial real estate," she said. "She knew the Norris firm by reputation. They're sound." Wade looked at her across the table. The fire was going behind him and the morning light was coming through the east window, and there was, for a moment, a quality to the room that Evelyn did not examine too closely, because examining it would have made her self-conscious about it. "You wrote to Philadelphia about my cattle broker," he said. "I wrote to Philadelphia about a brokerage firm that might solve your March problem," she said. "There's a difference." She poured coffee for both of them. "Write back today. Give him the count and tell him you can have a quality assessment done by the end of the month." "I haven't done a formal count since October." "Then we'll do one," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than the situation required. Then he picked up the letter and said, "All right, what?" The cattle count took 3 days. It was not work Evelyn had done before in any form, but she approached it the way she approached everything that was new to her, by watching what the people who knew it did, asking specific questions when watching was not enough, and then doing the work without pretending she was better at it than she was. Gus taught her how to read the ear tags. Fennick showed her the system Wade used for tracking, which was a combination of a hand count and marks in a field book, and which worked adequately but could have been more efficient. She said this to Fenwick on the second day, carefully. He looked at her. More efficient how? She showed him the modification she had in mind, a different way of grouping the tallies that reduced the chance of miscounting when the cattle moved. He looked at it for a long moment and then said, which she had learned was Fenwick, for that's correct. By the third evening, they had a count that Wade was confident in, and she had a better understanding of the herd than she had possessed before. Which animals were strongest, which were showing their age, what the composition looked like going into a sales season. She wrote it up in the clean, organized way she had learned from the millinery woman in Philadelphia, who had kept records that were models of clarity. Wade looked at what she had produced and was quiet for a moment. "This is better than what I had," he said. "It's the same information," she said, "just arranged so you can find it." He set it down and looked at her. "Where did you actually come from, Evelyn?" The question was not what she had expected. She thought about deflecting it, then decided against it. "A row house on a narrow street in Philadelphia," she said. "My father was a printer. My mother died when I was 12. I kept house for my father and my brother until my brother married, and my father's hands got too bad for the press, and the business had to close." She kept her voice matter-of-fact about all of this, because it was what it was, and nothing was improved by dramatizing it. "After that, I worked for the millinery shop, 7 years. And then you answered an advertisement." "And then I answered an advertisement," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. The counting work was done, and they were at the kitchen table, and the day was almost gone. "I'm sorry," he said. "About Hale. About all of it." "It's not your fault," she said. "No, but you came a long way for something that wasn't what it was supposed to be." He looked at the table. "And you ended up here, which is—" He stopped. "Which is not what I planned," she said. "But it's not nothing, Wade." He looked up. She had not said his name much, she realized. It felt different than she had expected it to, saying it in that context. She picked up the field book and closed it. "Get the letter to Norris out tomorrow. The timing matters." He said, "Yes," and looked back at the table, and she went to start supper. The morning of the Mercer meeting was cold and clear, the kind of Wyoming winter day that was beautiful in the way of something that could also kill you if you stopped respecting it. Evelyn put on her best dress, which was not her very best dress, that was still folded in the bottom of her suitcase, reserved for occasions that warranted it, but was presentable and dark, and said, she hoped, that she was a person who took a meeting seriously without being intimidated by one. Wade looked at her when she came out of her room and said nothing, which was his way of indicating approval. They rode into Harlow Creek together in the wagon, which was itself a statement of some kind. She was aware of this, aware that being seen arriving with Wade Callahan would carry meaning in a town that had already been talking about the woman from the East who was living at his ranch. She had decided some time ago not to let the fact of the talk govern what she did. Talk was going to happen regardless. The only question was whether she conducted herself in a way she was satisfied with. Mercer's office was on the main street, in a building that was new enough to still smell of fresh timber and large enough relative to its neighbors to make a point without stating one. His name was on the door in painted letters. Inside, it was well furnished in the frontier style, solid, functional, with just enough detail to signal money without overplaying it. There were already 2 other men there when they arrived, both ranchers. She knew one of them by sight from a brief introduction at the general store. Tom Whitfield, north of Harlow Creek, mid-50s, a man with the look of someone who had been dealing with difficult situations for long enough that his face had permanently arranged itself around the effort. The other man she didn't know, younger, perhaps 30, with a new coat and the tense posture of someone who was not entirely sure what he had come into. Mercer shook Wade's hand, looked at Evelyn, and said, "Miss Hartwell," with the exact neutrality of a man deciding in the moment how to handle an unexpected variable. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and sat down in one of the chairs before he could indicate whether she was invited to. The meeting was structured the way Mercer structured things, with a reasonable surface and a direction underneath. He talked about the valley's water situation, which was real enough. A dry stretch 2 years prior had dropped the creek levels, and some of the smaller operations further down the tributary had struggled. He talked about the need for a coordinated approach to water management. He talked about the land company's interest in being part of a solution. Tom Whitfield listened with the patient attention of a man who had heard several versions of this kind of talk and was not in a hurry to respond to any of them. The younger man, his name was Caraway, she gathered, asked a few questions that showed he understood the surface of the conversation without yet seeing what was underneath it. Evelyn listened and did not speak for most of the first half hour. What Mercer was proposing, underneath the reasonable language, was a water management agreement that would give the land company a coordinating role in how the tributary water was allocated. The agreement would involve the major landholders, meaning those who held land along the tributary's length, signing a document that acknowledged the company's role. It was framed as cooperative. What it was a mechanism for control. Once the agreement was signed, any decision about water allocation would require the company's participation, which in practice meant the company's approval. And the company's first point of leverage was the North Pasture, the land the bank was threatening to take from Wade in March. She let the first half hour go by. She needed to understand the full shape of the thing before she said anything about it. When Mercer paused to allow questions, Whitfield said, "What does coordinating role mean in legal terms?" Mercer said, "Participation in allocation discussions." "Veto power?" Whitfield said. Mercer said, "Collaborative decision-making," which was not an answer. Whitfield received it with the expression of a man filing it accurately. Then Evelyn said, "What happens to the agreement if the land company acquires the North Pasture?" The room went quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet when a question has arrived that the person running the meeting was not prepared to receive from the direction it came from. Mercer looked at her. His expression remained composed, but she could see the half-second adjustment happening behind it. "The agreement is between landholders," he said. "Changes in land ownership would be addressed within the existing terms." "Which terms?" she said. "You haven't shared a written document yet. Everything we've discussed has been verbal." "Today is a preliminary conversation," Mercer said. "The document would come later. Then the question of what happens when the land company acquires land currently held by one of the agreeing parties is a question that needs to be answered before any agreement is signed," she said, "since it's a foreseeable event." She kept her voice even and did not look away from him. "Given that the company is currently in discussions about at least one property in this valley." Whitfield looked at Mercer. Caraway looked at Evelyn. Mercer said, "I don't think this is the appropriate venue." "It seems like exactly the appropriate venue," she said. "If the land company's interest in the water agreement is separate from its interest in acquiring land, then the question has a simple answer. If it's not separate, then the people in this room should understand that before they agree to anything." There was a silence. Mercer picked up his pen and set it down again, which was not something a man in control of a room did. "Miss Hartwell, with respect, you're not a landholder." "I'm representing the interests of one," she said, "which I believe is why I was invited." Beside her, Wade said nothing. She had not looked at him since they sat down. She was aware of him, his stillness, the quality of attention he was paying to the room. But she did not look at him because she did not want Mercer to read anything from it. Whitfield said, "She's asking a fair question, Douglas." Mercer looked at Whitfield. Something passed between them, the complicated acknowledgement of two men who have known each other long enough to have layers to the knowing. Then Mercer said, "The land company's interest in any specific property is a separate matter from the water agreement." "Put that in writing and I'll believe it," Whitfield said. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. Mercer kept the surface smooth, but the smooth surface had developed something beneath it that was not going to go away. And everyone in the room knew it. No one signed anything. No one agreed to anything. Mercer said he would have a written document prepared for review. When they walked out into the cold street, Whitfield caught up with them before they reached the wagon. He shook Wade's hand. Then he looked at Evelyn. "I've been trying to figure out what he was actually after for 6 months," he said. "You put your finger on it in 30 minutes. The water rights are the point," she said. "Everything else is how he gets there." Whitfield looked at her with an expression that was partly assessment and partly something else, something that looked like relief. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying a suspicion alone for a long time and has finally had someone else confirm it. "You mind if I call on you both when that document comes?" he said. "I'd like another set of eyes on the language before I touch it." "Come any time," Wade said. Whitfield nodded and walked back down the street. and Evelyn and Wade got in the wagon and drove out of Harlow Creek in the thin winter light. They were a mile out of town before either of them spoke. "You knew what he was doing from the start," Wade said. It was not an accusation, more like something he needed to say out loud. "I suspected," she said. "I wasn't certain until he answered the question about the document." "When he didn't answer it?" "Right." Another mile of silence. The road north was rutted from the freeze, and the wagon moved with the particular jolting rhythm of hard ground, and the cold came off the fields on both sides in flat waves that Evelyn had started to recognize as a permanent condition of this country rather than a temporary one. "Mercer is not going to be pleased with you," Wade said. "No," she agreed. "He's the kind of man who keeps a list." "I know." She looked at the road ahead. "But if he gets that agreement signed with the water rights language he wants, he controls who gets water in a dry year. That means he controls whether the smaller operations survive. That means over time he absorbs them. That's what the land company is. It's a mechanism for waiting out the people who can't hold on." Wade was quiet. "The North Pasture note is part of it," she said. "I don't know if he engineered it or just recognized the opportunity when the bank called it in, but it fits the pattern." She pulled her coat tighter. "If he gets your land, he controls the source. Then he doesn't need anyone's agreement about anything." "So what do we do?" Wade said. She had been thinking about this since she first looked at the ledger. "Pay the note," she said, "Norris and the Eastern buyers, if it works out. And in the meantime, we file the water rights properly. Register the tributary access at the county seat in Cheyenne before anyone else does. If it's on record, the agreement Mercer's drafting has nothing to coordinate. The rights are already established." Wade looked at her. "Filing water rights costs money." "Less than losing the North Pasture," she said. He turned back to the road. His jaw worked for a moment in the way she had noticed when he was moving through something difficult. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since the night Mercer came to the house," she said. "He absorbed this. You didn't say." "I wasn't sure yet," she said. "I'm sure now." The reply from Norris came in the second week of December, and it was better than they had hoped. The Eastern buyers were offering a price that, if they sold the right portion of the herd, would cover the bank note with enough remaining to make a start on the fence repairs that needed doing before spring. Not comfortable, not easy, but possible. Wade sat at the kitchen table with the numbers in front of him for a long time. Gus and Fenwick were in the barn. Outside, the temperature had dropped again and the sky was the flat white that preceded snow. Evelyn sat across the table and waited. "It means selling 40 head, he said. "Maybe 45. "I know. That takes the herd down to," he calculated. "It'll take 2 good seasons to build back to where I was." "Yes," she said. "But you'll still have the North Pasture and the water rights if we file before Mercer gets his agreement together." He looked at the numbers. He looked at them the way a person looks at a decision they have already made but need to sit with for a moment before acknowledging it. 2 good seasons, he said. "That's not guaranteed." "Nothing out here is guaranteed," she said, "but losing the North Pasture is guaranteed if the note isn't paid." He picked up the pen. He wrote back to Norris accepting the terms. She got up and made coffee and said nothing more about it, because there was nothing more to say. The decision was made. What came after it would come. What? 3 days later, Harlow Creek delivered its opinion. She had been expecting it in some form, though not this specific form. She went to the general store for supplies on a Thursday morning, alone, because Wade was dealing with a heifer that had developed a respiratory problem, and Gus's shoulder had flared again, and there was no one else to go. She went in, and the woman behind the counter, a Mrs. Aldrich, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, who had been pleasant enough on Evelyn's previous visits, served her with a courtesy that had gone several degrees cooler than before. 2 other women were in the store when Evelyn arrived and left while she was still shopping. One of them nodded. One of them did not. It was the second one's particular not nodding that told Evelyn the shape of the conversation that had been happening in Harlow Creek about the woman from the east who was living at the Callahan ranch. Not as a housekeeper, not as a relation, as something that did not have a clear category, which in a town of this size was itself the problem. She bought what she needed and carried it to the wagon and drove back to the ranch. She thought about it on the road home. She was not wounded by it, or not primarily wounded. She had grown up in a city where being female and without family money meant navigating judgment as a permanent condition, and she had developed a relationship with other people's opinions that was functional rather than warm. What concerned her was not what it meant for herself, but what it might mean for Wade, who had to live in this valley long after any decision about her situation was made. She told him about it that evening. Not the whole of it, just the cooling temperature in the store, the two women who left, enough to convey the shape of the thing. He listened. He was sitting across from her, and he did not look away while she talked. When she finished, he said, "I know." "You knew already?" "Whitfield said something to me after the meeting," he said. "He said the town had been talking." She nodded. "It was inevitable." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does it change what you want to do?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "Does it change what you want to do?" He held her gaze. "No," he said. They sat in the quiet for a moment with that exchange between them, which was more than either of them had said about the actual situation since the night she asked to stay. "There's one way to resolve it," she said. "That's obvious. I'm not raising it as a suggestion. I'm raising it because it's there and we both know it's there, and I think it's probably better to have said so than to leave it unsaid." She kept her voice steady. "A formal arrangement would settle the question of what I am here. It would also complicate things between us in ways that, I don't know how you feel about any of this, Wade. I don't think I should assume." He was quiet for a long time. Not uncomfortable quiet. Thinking quiet. "Margaret," he said finally, we had 4 years. They were good years. When she died, I decided that was it for me. Not a decision I announced, just one I settled into." He looked at the table. "I've been in it so long I stopped noticing I'd made it." She waited. "I notice you," he said. It came out plainly, without decoration, which was the only way he said anything. "I've noticed you since the first morning when I came into the kitchen and there was food on the stove and someone had built the fire up before I got there." He looked at her. "I don't know what that is yet. I'm not someone who decides things fast." "Neither am I," she said. "Under normal circumstances." He made the sound that was not quite a laugh. "These aren't normal circumstances." "No," she agreed. "They're not." The fire settled. The wind moved across the valley outside. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not as an offer, just as a fact. Whatever we figure out or don't figure out, I'm not leaving because of what Mrs. Aldrich thinks." He nodded. "All right," he said. That was all. But it was enough, for now. The water rights filing required a trip to Cheyenne, which required time and money that were both in short supply. Wade decided to go himself, taking Gus for company on the road. They would be gone 4 days, 2 days travel each way, 1 day at the county seat. While he was gone, Evelyn ran the ranch. She had known this was coming and had not said anything about it, because saying anything about it would have invited a conversation about whether she could manage it, and she had no patience for that conversation. She could manage it. She had been managing it alongside Wade for weeks. Now was that she was doing it without him there, which was a difference in logistics and not in her fundamental competence. Fenwick, she could tell, was watching the first morning to see how things went. He came to the kitchen door at 5 as usual, and when she handed him his coffee and gave him the morning's priorities, the heifer's treatment, the east fence where a post had shifted in the new frost, the feed schedule, he took the coffee and listened and said, "That's the order I'd do it," and went out. That was, as far as she was concerned, settled. The 4 days were not easy. The heifer's condition worsened on the second day, and she sat up with it through the night, not because she was certain she was doing the right thing, but because leaving it alone felt worse than being wrong beside it. Fenwick checked on her at midnight, found her in the barn with the animal, and sat with her for an hour without either of them saying much. By morning, the heifer had turned a corner. Whether it was the treatment or the turning or some combination she couldn't isolate, the animal was on its feet by noon. On the third day, she had visitors. Tom Whitfield rode up in the late afternoon with a woman she had not met. His wife, Clara, a solid, direct woman of perhaps 50, with steady eyes and a manner that contained its own assessment without broadcasting it. Evelyn brought them inside and made coffee and set out what she had on hand. Clara Whitfield looked around the kitchen with the comprehensive survey of a woman who understood kitchens as texts and said, Tom tells me you're the one who broke open the Mercer meeting. I asked a question, Evelyn said. He says you asked the right question, Clara said. In this valley, that's different from asking a question. She accepted the coffee. We've been watching Mercer for 2 years. Tom figured out the water piece 6 months ago, but couldn't get anyone else to see it. It was clear once you knew to look for it, Evelyn said. Most things are, Clara said. That's not the same as looking. They stayed for an hour. Clara talked about the valley, the people in it, the history of it, who had been there long and who was new, what the last dry year had done to the smaller operations. She talked with the fluency of someone who had been paying attention for a long time, and Evelyn listened the way she always listened, for the information in what was said and the information in what wasn't. Before they left, Clara said, Mrs. Aldrich's a good woman. She's cautious. This valley's seen some things that made it cautious. I understand, Evelyn said. Clara looked at her steadily. I don't think you need people to approve of you, she said, but this valley's small enough that you'll work better with them than without them. Give it time. She pulled on her gloves. And keep asking the right questions. After they rode out, Evelyn stood in the kitchen for a moment in the thin afternoon light. Something had shifted. She could feel it, the way you feel a temperature change before you can articulate what changed. Clara Whitfield was a woman the valley listened to. The visit itself was, she understood, a statement. Give it time, Clara had said. She was beginning to think she had time to give. Wade came back on the 5th day, 1 day later than planned, because the road south had been slow with ice, and Gus's horse had thrown a shoe 20 miles out of Cheyenne. He rode in looking tired in the particular way of a man who has been too long in a saddle in cold weather, and he came inside without taking his coat off first, which told her he had news he wanted to say. It's filed, he said. The water rights are registered. The North Tributary access is on record at the county seat under the Callahan name. She set down what she was holding. Both banks of it? Both banks. Whitfield's rights are on record too. I filed for him while I was there, with his written authorization. He's already sent it to me last week. He looked at her. You knew he'd do that. I thought he might, she said. 2 names on the water rights record is better than 1. Mercer's agreement can't override a registered claim. Wade took his coat off and hung it by the door. He looked tired, and also, underneath the tired, something else. A quality she had seen before on the fence line in the snow, but more of it now. Like a man who had gone somewhere and done a difficult thing and come back knowing the difficult thing was done. The Norris sale is confirmed, he said. The buyers are coming in February, 42 head. He sat down at the table. If the price holds, we cover the note, with some left. She nodded. She sat across from him. Outside the window, the late afternoon was going toward dark. Gus's shoulder, she said. He'll live. He's been living with it for years. He should see a doctor. I know, he won't. I know, she said, but someone should keep saying it. He looked at her across the table. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her increasingly, directly, without the slight reservation that had been there in the beginning, the one that said he was not sure yet how much to take in. That reservation had been going for a while. She had noticed its absence and not said anything about it. The heifer, he said. Better. On her feet. Fenwick told me you sat with her. Someone had to. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What happened with Whitfield while I was gone? She told him about the visit, Clara's directness, what she had said about Mrs. Aldrich, the particular nature of the conversation, and what she thought it meant. He listened with his full attention. When she finished, he said, Clara Whitfield doesn't visit people she hasn't already decided about. I gathered that, Evelyn said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and she got up and filled it and her own and sat back down. I've been thinking, he said. On the road. 4 days is a long time on a road in cold weather. You think about things. What things? She said, though she had a sense. He looked at the table, then at her. You said you weren't raising the formal arrangement as a suggestion, he said, when we talked before I left. I wasn't. I know, he said. I'm raising it. She looked at him. I'm not good at this, he said, at saying things like this. Margaret used to say I communicated primarily by showing up, and I thought she was teasing me, but I think she was accurate. He looked at his coffee. I've been showing up next to you for weeks, And I think that's been saying something, but I don't want to assume you've read it the way I mean it. I've read it, she said. He looked up. I've been showing up next to you too, she said, in case that wasn't clear. Something settled in his face. Not a dramatic shift. He was not a man of dramatic shifts, but something that had been held carefully for a long time loosened, and she could see it in the way the lines around his eyes changed. I don't know what kind of a husband I'd make, he said. I know what kind of rancher I am. The rest of it, I've been away from it for 3 years. I don't know what kind of wife I'd be either, she said. I've never done it. I almost did it with a man who turned out to be fiction. She kept her voice even. I know I'm not afraid of this country. I know I'm not afraid of the work. I know I'm not afraid of you. She looked at him. Those seemed like the relevant qualifications. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Will you marry me, Evelyn? He said it the way he said everything, straight, without ornament, looking directly at her. She thought briefly of the 17 letters Arthur Hale had written, all that careful, detailed language that had amounted to nothing. There was something to be said for a man who used fewer words and meant all of them. Yes, she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Outside, the last light was leaving the valley, and the cold was settling in the way it did here, completely, with a kind of authority that demanded you take it seriously. Somewhere beyond the barn, one of the horses moved in its stall. The fire in the kitchen stove was burning steady. There was nothing smooth or perfect about any of it. The note was not paid yet. Mercer still had a water agreement in draft somewhere. The north fence still needed proper postwork. Gus's shoulder was still a problem, and the heifer might have a relapse, and there were approximately 42 things that could still go wrong before spring. But the water rights were on record, the sale was confirmed, and the woman who had arrived at a train station in the dark with a suitcase, and no one coming for her, was sitting at a kitchen table in Wyoming, and the man across from her had just asked her a question and received an answer, and both of them were exactly where they intended to be. She reached across the table and moved his empty coffee cup and replaced it with a full one. He looked at it, then at her. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, she said, and went back to making supper. They told no one for 2 weeks. Not out of secrecy exactly. More out of the particular reluctance of two people who had arrived at something real and were not ready yet to have other people's reactions layered over the top of it. There was a quality to those 2 weeks that Evelyn noticed and did not examine too closely, because examining it would have changed it. Wade was the same man he had been, same hours, same work, same economy of words. But there was something different in the house, a quality of intention, maybe. The sense that two people who had been operating in parallel were now, quietly, operating in the same direction. They did not discuss wedding arrangements immediately. There was too much else pressing. The Norris buyers were coming in February, which was 6 weeks away, and the logistics of moving 42 head of cattle to the railhead in Laramie required planning that had to start now. Wade spent the evenings after supper with maps and schedules, and Evelyn sat across from him with the account book, and they worked through the numbers together. Feed costs for the drive, hiring a temporary hand for the week of the move, the gap between what they expected to receive and what they needed to clear the note. The gap was manageable. It was not comfortable, but it was manageable, which was as much as they could ask for. Fenwick found out about the engagement on a Thursday morning when he came to the kitchen door and found Evelyn reorganizing the shelf above the stove, which required standing on a chair, and Wade standing below her with his hand on the back of the chair to keep it steady, not because the chair needed steadying, particularly, but because he was there, and it was the natural thing to do. Fenwick stood in the doorway for a moment looking at this tableau and said, in a tone that was different from his usual HM. Then he came in and poured his coffee and did not say another word about it. That evening, Gus found out, because Fenwick told him. Gus came to the main house after supper and knocked, and when Wade opened the door, Gus shook his hand with both of his and said, "About time," and then looked past Wade to where Evelyn was at the kitchen table and said, "Miss Hartwell, I'm glad you didn't get back on the train," and then left before either of them could respond to either statement. Evelyn looked at Wade. "He's been on this ranch 22 years, Wade said. "He waited 2 weeks to say about time," she said. "That's practically immediate for Gus." She laughed. It came out before she decided to let it, which was its own kind of information, so. The Whitfields had to be told, which meant a visit to their ranch north of town. Evelyn had been thinking about how to manage this, not because she was uncertain about the news, but because Clara Whitfield was a woman whose opinion of the situation had weight in the valley and whose reaction was worth attending to. She went with Wade on a Saturday when the weather was tolerable, and they had coffee in the Whitfield kitchen, which was larger than Wade's and had curtains on the windows and children's drawings pinned to the wall beside the door, though the Whitfield children were grown. Wade told Tom. Clara watched Evelyn's face while he did. When he finished, Tom Whitfield said, "Congratulations," and shook Wade's hand and then Evelyn's in turn. Clara Whitfield looked at Evelyn and said, "Good." Just that, in the voice of someone who has considered a situation thoroughly and arrived at a verdict. Then she got up and brought out a tin of shortbread that had clearly been made recently and not intended for casual visitors, which told Evelyn more than the word had. On the ride back, Wade said, "Clara Whitfield doesn't bring out good shortbread for people she doesn't approve of." "I know," Evelyn said. "Tom says she made that tin last week." "She was waiting to see what happened," Evelyn said. "Is that unsettling?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "It's what I'd do." Mercer's water agreement arrived in written form the second week of January. It was delivered to the ranch by a boy from town who clearly had no idea what he was carrying, and Evelyn was the one who received it and signed for it and sat down at the kitchen table to read it before Wade came in from the fields. By the time he came in, she had read it twice. It was more sophisticated than she had expected, and she had expected it to be sophisticated. Mercer had clearly had a real lawyer write it, someone who understood how to make a controlling document look like a cooperative one. The language about the land company's coordinating role was buried in the third section, after two sections of reasonable-sounding provisions about allocation formulas and dispute resolution mechanisms. Someone who read it quickly, or who was not looking for the specific thing, could easily miss what the third section actually said. What it said, in the language beneath the language, was this: any change in water allocation required unanimous agreement among the signatories, and the land company was defined as a permanent signatory regardless of whether it held land in the valley, which meant the company had a permanent veto over every water decision, even if none of the actual landholders wanted the veto exercised. She was still sitting there when Wade came in, and she slid the document across the table and pointed to the third section without speaking. He read it. He read it again. His jaw worked in the familiar way. "He's thorough," Wade said. "He is," she agreed, "but it's only effective if people sign it. What if some people do and some don't?" She had thought about this. The ones who sign give the company veto power over shared water. The ones who don't are outside the agreement and in theory retain independent rights. But Mercer knows that the value of the agreement to him increases the more signatures he gets. If he can get a majority of the major water users to sign, the holdouts are effectively isolated. He can then make the water allocation discussion happen within the agreement's framework and exclude the non-signers from the conversation. Wade sat down across from her. "Can he do that? Legally?" "I don't know," she said. "I'm not a lawyer, but I know that in practice, if the people who sit at the table have the authority to make decisions, the people not at the table don't get a decision." She pulled the document back toward her. "We need to show this to someone who understands property law, before Mercer starts collecting signatures. There's a lawyer in Cheyenne, Hatcher. I've used him for land transactions. Write to him today," she said. "Send the document. Ask him specifically about the third section and whether registered water rights override it." She said this last part carefully because it was the question she had been building toward. If the registered water rights she and Wade had filed, and that Whitfield had filed, were legally sufficient to establish their claims independently of any agreement, then Mercer's document was a trap with no teeth for those who had already secured their rights. But she did not know enough law to be certain of this, and being wrong about it had significant consequences. Wade looked at her. "You've been sitting with this all morning." "Since it arrived," she said. He picked up the document. He looked at it, then at her. "You know what I notice?" She waited. "I haven't had to figure any of this out alone," he said. He said it simply, without sentiment attached to it, the way he said things that were simply true. She looked at the table. Something in her chest did what it had been doing with increasing frequency in the presence of this man, a particular kind of movement that she was not yet entirely sure what to do with. You shouldn't have had to figure it out alone in the first place, she said. That's what I keep thinking about. He put the document down. I'm going to write to Hatcher, he said, today. Good, she said. The letter to the lawyer went out that afternoon. While they waited for a reply, the valley continued its ordinary business, which in January meant a particular kind of grimness. Cold that did not relent, work that did not stop, the short days that made the evenings feel longer than they were. Evelyn used the evenings. She had started something in November that she had not quite named to herself at the time, but could name now. She was building a picture of the ranch's full situation, not just the immediate crises, but the structural issues underneath them. The north fence was a symptom. The staffing problem was a symptom. The banknote was a symptom. The underlying condition was a ranch that had been run by a man operating alone for 3 years, absorbing losses without enough capacity to address the causes. She put together a list, not a dramatic list, not presented to Wade with any ceremony or conclusion, just a working document for herself, notes organized by category. What needed repair? What needed replacement? What needed more labor than they currently had? What could wait and what couldn't? She did it in the same ledger format she had learned from the millinery woman in Philadelphia, because that format was the one she knew and it was functional. She showed it to Wade on a Sunday evening when there was nothing else pressing. He looked at it for a long time. He turned the pages slowly. He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was thinking, rather than in the way he was quiet when he was done. The well casing, he said. On the east side. You've got that listed. Gus mentioned it in passing, she said. He didn't think I was paying attention. Were you? I'm always paying attention, she said. He looked back at the document. The casing is going. It'll need replacing by summer or we lose water pressure to the east pasture. He turned another page. The barn roof. I knew about the barn roof. It needs doing before spring rain, she said, not after. I know. He looked at the page. Where did you get the estimate for the roofing materials? I wrote to the hardware supplier in Laramie, she said. Describe the dimensions. He quoted me by letter. Wade was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You wrote to a hardware supplier in Laramie about my barn roof. Our barn roof, she said. As of March, at the latest. Something moved across his face. It was not surprise. She didn't surprise him much anymore, she had noticed, but something more complicated, more interior. He set the document down and looked at her. When we get through February, he said, I'd like to go to the magistrate in town and make it official. The marriage, before the spring work starts. The end of February, she said, after the cattle sale. I want to know the note is clear before we do anything else. He nodded. Practical. Consistently, she said. He made the sound that was close to a laugh. I'm going to need to stop being surprised when you say things like that. You should have stopped being surprised some time ago, she said. He looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention that she had come to depend on in a way she had not expected to depend on anything out here. Probably, he said. The lawyer's reply from Cheyenne arrived 10 days later. Hatcher was a man of concise written style, which Evelyn appreciated. He said 3 things clearly. First, that the registered water rights did take precedence over the agreement, provided the rights had been properly filed and were not being contested, which they were and were not. Second, that Mercer's document was, in his professional opinion, an attempt to create a private water authority with teeth that the law did not currently give him, and that any signatory should be aware they were conceding something of value without compensation. Third, that the document had a specific vulnerability. The permanent signatory status of the land company could be challenged if the company did not hold land in the valley, and if they could establish that Mercer's company was not a landholder in the relevant legal sense, the entire third section could be argued void. She read this paragraph 3 times. If the land company's status as a permanent signatory depended on it being treated as a landholder, and if they could demonstrate that the company did not hold land in the valley in a legally recognized way, then the agreement was built on a premise that could be pulled out from under it, which meant the agreement's strength depended entirely on Mercer acquiring land in the valley, specifically the north pasture. She put the letter down and sat with this for a moment. Everything Mercer had done, the banknote, the water meeting, the agreement, formed a single sequence. He needed the North Pasture not just for the water source, but because without it, his company's status as a valley landholder was legally questionable enough to collapse the agreement. The land acquisition and the water agreement were not separate strategies. They were one strategy with two moving parts, and if you removed one part, the other didn't work. Wade came in from the afternoon's work to find her sitting at the kitchen table with the lawyer's letter and a piece of paper on which she had written a diagram of connected points. He looked at the diagram. He looked at her. He needs the land to make the agreement work, she said. Not just for the water. If the company doesn't hold valley land, his permanent signatory status is challengeable. The whole thing falls over. Wade pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the diagram. She had not drawn it for his benefit. She had drawn it to see if the logic held when she laid it out. But she could see him following the lines. The banknote, he said. I don't know if he engineered it or opportunized on it, she said. But yes. Paying the note removes his path to the land, which removes his path to the agreement, which removes his ability to control the water. Wade was quiet for a long moment. The February sale has to happen, he said. Yes, she said, and nothing can interfere with it. He looked at the diagram. He doesn't know about the lawyer's letter. No, she said. Does he know we filed the water rights? He'll know, she said. It's a public record. He's probably already checked. She picked up the lawyer's letter and refolded it. The filing doesn't stop him from collecting signatures on the agreement from people who don't have registered rights. He can still build a coalition, but it means we're outside that coalition and protected from it, and so is Whitfield. What about Caraway and the other smaller operations? She had been thinking about this. They need to know what the third section means, she said. Someone needs to show them the lawyer's letter. That's a conversation I'd have to have, Wade said. You or Whitfield, she said. Whitfield has more standing. He's been here longer. She looked at Wade. Would he do it? I'll ask him tomorrow. She nodded. She picked up the diagram and looked at it again, then turned it over. One more thing, she said. Mercer is going to move faster now. He knows the filing is on record, and he knows his timeline is compressed. If he doesn't get signatures before February, the sale happens, and the note clears and he loses his opening. She set the paper down. He'll do something. I don't know what yet. Wade looked at her steadily. You think he'll come at the sale directly? I think a man who has built a complicated scheme doesn't abandon it when it starts going wrong, she said. He finds another lever. She met his eyes. We need to be watching for what that is. What that was arrived in the form of a rumor, which was how most things arrived in Harlow Creek. She heard it from Clara Whitfield, who rode out to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon with the manner of a woman who had information that needed delivering in person. Evelyn was hanging laundry when she saw the horse coming up the road and went to meet it, because Clara Whitfield did not make casual social calls on Wednesday afternoons in January. There's a story going around, Clara said without preamble, sitting straight-backed on her horse in the cold. That Wade's cattle are sick, respiratory illness, spreading through the herd. Evelyn was very still for a moment. It's the heifer, she said. One animal. She recovered 3 weeks ago. I know that, Clara said. The rumor doesn't. Where did it start? Clara looked at her with an expression that said they both knew the answer to that question. It's been going around the feed store and the livery since Monday. If the Norris buyers hear it before they arrive, they'll lower the offer, Evelyn said. Or cancel. Or cancel, Clara agreed. Evelyn's mind was moving fast. The buyers from the east were not from the valley. They had no independent way to assess a rumor's accuracy. They would have no existing relationship with Wade that would give them a reason to discount it. A rumor of widespread illness in a herd, if it reached them before they arrived, would either kill the sale or allow Mercer, or whoever he worked through, to approach them first with an alternative offer. Mercer's alternative would involve different cattle, or perhaps a brokered arrangement that served his ends. When are the buyers arriving? Clara asked. 3rd week of February, Evelyn said. You have 4 weeks. Clara looked at her directly. The rumor needs to be answered, not denied, answered. There's a difference. I know the difference, Evelyn said. You counter a rumor with a denial and you make the rumor bigger. You counter it with evidence and you make the person who started it look like a liar. Clara allowed herself a small expression that was as close to satisfaction as she permitted in her face. Tom can speak to Caraway and the 2 men from the south end of the valley, she said. They've all seen the Callahan herd recently enough to say something credible. She paused. You'll need something from Norris. Some form of communication that says the buyers are still coming. I'll write to him today, Evelyn said. And the heifer, Clara said. The recovered heifer. Get it in front of people. Healthy animal, visible, with a date people can attach to it. She picked up her reins. Evidence that people can see is worth more than evidence on paper in a town like this. She rode out. Evelyn stood on the cold road and watched her go, and then went inside and sat down and wrote the letter to Norris, and then wrote 2 other letters. One to Hatcher asking whether a commercially damaging rumor constituted actionable misrepresentation under Wyoming territory law, and one to Tom Whitfield summarizing the situation and asking if he could make the rounds of the South Valley ranchers by the end of the week. She had the letters ready when Wade came in for supper. She laid them on the table. He read them in order, without interrupting himself. Then he set them down and looked at the fire for a moment. He went after the sale, he said. Yes. Through the herd's reputation. Yes. She sat across from him. It's smart. It's not traceable to him directly. A rumor has no author. And if it works, the buyers cancel or negotiate down, the sale doesn't cover the note, and he gets the land through the bank in March. Wade was quiet for a moment. He doesn't know about Hatcher's letter, he said. He doesn't know the legal argument about the agreement's signatory status. No, he thinks the land acquisition is about the water source. He doesn't know it's also about the legal structure of his agreement. She looked at him. That's actually useful. He's playing one version of the situation. We know too. He looked at the letters. Send them all, he said. Tomorrow morning. He nodded. He picked up his fork, looked at the supper on the table, and then looked at her. When does this stop? He said. Not with frustration, with the plain curiosity of a man who genuinely wanted to know. When he runs out of levers, she said, or when we've removed enough of them that continuing isn't worth his time. She picked up her own fork. He's a businessman. At some point, the cost of pursuing this exceeds the value of the north pasture. We have to make it not worth it. And you think we can? She thought about the registered water rights, the lawyer's letter, the Whitfields, the letters she had written and would send, the heifer standing healthy in the barn. I think we have more than he expected us to have, she said. That's usually enough, given time. He looked at her for a moment. How did Arthur Hale write 17 letters to you and then not show up? He said. She looked up. I keep thinking about it, he said. Not about him. About the fact that you were... He stopped, seemed to choose. Available. For 17 letters worth of effort. She put her fork down. I was 31, and I had spent 7 years keeping books and mending hats and paying someone else's rent, and I wanted something that was mine, she said. It came out without much softening, which was accurate. The advertisement was... It was a possibility. I'm not ashamed of having wanted one. I didn't say you should be, he said. I said I keep thinking about it. About the fact that you came out here at all, that you were at that station. He looked at the table. I drove past that station at night 3 times a week, all winter for 4 years, and never stopped for anything. The night I stopped was the night you were there. She looked at him. I'm not drawing any conclusion from that, he said, because he was not a man who drew large conclusions easily. I'm just saying I notice it. She was quiet for a moment. I notice it too, she said. They ate supper. Outside, the January night pressed against the windows and the fire held and the ranch was quiet. In the way it was always quiet at this hour. Completely, with a kind of permanence to the silence that she had stopped finding unsettling and started finding something closer to the opposite. The letters produced results within 2 weeks. Norris wrote back by express mail. She had included the words time-sensitive in her letter, and he had apparently taken them seriously. His letter confirmed the buyer's arrival date, confirmed the agreed price, and included a line she had specifically requested, a note that the buyers had reviewed the herd documentation she had sent with the original inquiry and found it satisfactory. She had included that documentation knowing they might need it later, and now she had Norris's letter referencing it in writing. She sent a copy to Tom Whitfield and kept the original. Whitfield made his rounds of the South Valley ranchers within a week, as he had said he would. 3 of them, including Caraway, whose uncertain position at the January meeting had been on her mind, had seen Wade's herd recently enough to confirm its condition. Caraway, she learned from Clara, had also spoken to someone at the feed store. The rumor did not die immediately, because rumors rarely did. But it stopped spreading, which was the more achievable goal. Hatcher's letter about the legal question of reputation damage arrived, and was, as lawyers' letters tended to be, hedged with qualifications. Yes, a demonstrably false commercial rumor could be actionable under certain conditions. No, it was not easy to prove origin, and yes, the standard was high. But the letter itself was useful for what it represented. The option existed, and Mercer, if he was being advised by his own lawyers, would know it existed. She showed it to Wade and said, "We don't need to use this. We just need him to know we have it." He looked at the letter. "You want to send it to him?" "Not directly," she said. "But I want it to come to his attention that we've been in correspondence with a Cheyenne lawyer about our legal options. That's enough." She had thought about this carefully. Tom Whitfield has had occasion to mention our lawyer to his lawyer. They know each other, apparently. In the context of the water rights filing, that's the appropriate channel. Wade looked at her. "You've already asked Whitfield to do this." "I mentioned it might be useful for Tom to know that we'd received legal advice about the rumor situation," she said. "I didn't tell him what to do with that information." "You didn't need to." "No," she agreed. He set the letter down. He had an expression she had been seeing more of recently, one that she was not sure she could describe precisely, but which had something to do with being settled. Not comfortable, exactly, settled. The difference between a man who is going through something difficult and a man who is going through something difficult and has decided he is not alone in it. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "I want to go to the magistrate before February," he said. "I don't want to wait until after the sale." She looked at him steadily. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking how to say it. "Because none of this, the sale, the note, the water rights, the lawyer, none of it should be contingent on whether our situation is sorted," he said. "I don't want us to be something that happens after the important things. I want us to be current." She thought about this. She thought about the practical objection she had raised before, that she wanted the note clear before anything else. And she thought about whether that objection still held and found that it didn't, or not in the way it had. "All right," she said, "before February." They were married at the magistrate's office in Harlow Creek on the 23rd of January, with Tom and Clara Whitfield as witnesses, and Gus and Fenwick waiting outside in the cold, because the magistrate's office was small, and Gus had not wanted to miss it, and Fenwick had come because Gus was going. The magistrate was a practical man who handled the ceremony with efficiency and without embellishment, which suited both of them. Wade said what he was asked to say in a direct voice. Evelyn said what she was asked to say the same way. They signed the register. The magistrate signed it. Tom shook Wade's hand. Clara hugged Evelyn briefly, with the specific warmth of someone who does not hug carelessly. Outside, Gus shook both their hands and said nothing, which was the most emotional thing she had seen him do. Fenwick said, "About time," which was, she realized, exactly what Gus had said about the engagement. And she thought this was probably because Fenwick had been waiting the entire time to use the line, and Gus had beaten him to it. She told him so, quietly, when Gus was talking to Wade. Fenwick looked at her with the compressed, evaluating expression, and then the corner of his mouth moved, which was the most she had ever seen his face do in the direction of a smile. "Observant," he said. "Consistently," she said. He made a sound. It might, generously, have been called a laugh. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon, and the day was cold but clear, and the valley was spread out below the road in the winter light, in the particular way it had, large and honest and demanding and entirely itself. She had come to love it, she realized, not in a sentimental way. In the way that you love a thing that has asked something real of you and you have given it. Wade was driving. She was beside him. Neither of them was saying anything, which was their most natural mode. After a mile, she said, "The buyers come in 3 weeks." "I know," he said. "Everything else waits until after." "Agreed." Another mile of quiet, the horses' hooves on the frozen road, the valley opening up below them. "Wade," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping that night." He turned back to the road. His jaw worked for a moment in the familiar way. "I don't know why I stopped," he said. "I just did." "I know," she said. "That's what I'm thanking you for." The Norris buyers arrived on the 17th of February, two men from Chicago who wore good coats and looked at the Wyoming landscape with the expression of people encountering something they had not quite prepared themselves for. Their names were Grayson and Polk, and they were professional in the brisk, numerical way of men who dealt in quantities and had limited patience for anything that wasn't quantity. Wade met them at the road and brought them in. Evelyn made coffee and did not try to be invisible, because being invisible when you were the person who had organized the herd documentation and written the initial correspondence with Norris seemed both dishonest and impractical. Grayson looked at her when he came in, assessed the situation with the quick efficiency of a man who categorized things fast, and said, "You're Mrs. Callahan?" "I am," she said. "Norris mentioned you in his last letter," Grayson said. Said the documentation on this herd was the clearest he'd seen from a Wyoming operation. She poured the coffee. "Sit down," she said. "We have things to show you." The inspection took the better part of 2 days. Grayson and Polk went through the herd with a thoroughness that told her they were serious buyers who had been burned before and were not interested in being burned again. They looked at the ear tag records. They looked at the account documentation. They asked specific questions about the heifer, and Evelyn answered them without hesitation, because she knew exactly what had happened with the heifer and when and why, and her ability to answer in that kind of detail was itself a form of evidence. On the evening of the second day, Grayson said, "We heard something before we came about illness in the herd." The room went quiet. "One animal," Wade said. "November, recovered fully by December. You've seen the animal." "We have," Grayson said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the coffee in front of him. "Someone went to some trouble to make sure we heard about it before we arrived. Through Norris's office, indirectly. An anonymous communication." Evelyn looked at Grayson. "And yet you came." He looked back at her. "Norris vouched for the documentation, and someone had clearly gone to a lot of trouble to make sure we had accurate information in advance of the visit." He paused. "The same someone, we gathered, who had sent us the herd health records in the original inquiry package." She said nothing. She had sent her those records because it was the thorough thing to do, and because she had been thinking about exactly this possibility since November. "The offer stands," Grayson said. "We'll take the 42 head." Wade looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." Grayson said, "Good cattle are good cattle. That's what we came for." The sale was completed on paper the following morning. The buyers would take the herd at the railhead in Laramie in 3 weeks, and Norris's office would release the funds upon confirmation of delivery. The note would be cleared. The north pasture would remain. When Grayson and Polk rode out, Gus was in the yard. He watched the two men go down the road and then looked at Wade with an expression that said everything without saying anything. Wade said, "It's done." Gus nodded once, with the gravity of a man who understood what that meant. Then he went back to his work. Evelyn was standing in the doorway of the house. Wade turned and looked at her across the yard. She said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. He came across the yard and stood beside her on the step. They stood there for a moment looking at the road the buyers had gone down, and at the valley beyond it, and at the sky that was high and pale and enormous above the mountains. "The note clears in 3 weeks, she said. "Yes," he said. "And then there's the barn roof," she said, "and the well casing, and the north fence post work." "Yes," he said. "And the spring roundup," she said. "We'll need an extra hand for that, probably 2. He looked at her. There was something in his face that she had not seen before, or not clearly, not the almost smile or the settled quality or the direct attention, but something underneath all of those, something that was quieter and less defended. "You're planning the spring roundup," he said. "Someone has to," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know a man who might be available. He worked the roundup 2 years ago, left, but not on bad terms." "Write to him," she said. "I will." He was quiet. The morning was cold and the air was clear and the ranch was making its ordinary sounds. The horses in the barn, the wind on the fence wire. Fenwick somewhere around the back of the bunkhouse doing something that involved a hammer. "Evelyn," Wade said. She looked at him. He did not say anything else for a moment. He was a man who said things when he had the right words for them, and she had learned to wait for this rather than filling the space. She waited. "I built this place alone for 3 years," he said, "and I thought that was what it was going to be. I'd decided." He looked at the valley. "I didn't know I'd decided wrong until someone reorganized my pantry." She looked at the valley, too. I came here thinking I was trying to fix something that had gone wrong, she said. Turn the wrong train into the right one. She paused. I don't think that anymore. What do you think now? She considered it. I think the train I was supposed to be on would have taken me somewhere smaller, she said. I think this is where I was going. It was not something she would normally say. She was not given to that kind of statement, the large metaphorical claim about meaning and destination. But it was the accurate thing, and accuracy mattered more to her than composure, and this particular accuracy had been sitting in her for long enough that it needed to be said. Wade was quiet. He looked at the valley for another moment. Then he said, The barn roof. By April, she said. I know a man for that too, he said. Of course you do, she said. He made the sound that was now definitively a laugh, brief and low, the sound of a man who had been more surprised by that sound returning to him than by anything else that had happened in the last few months. She heard it and filed it in the same place she had been filing things since the first night. Everything she was learning about this place, this man, this life she had arrived at by the least expected path. They stood on the step until the cold became insistent. Then they went inside, and the door closed behind them, and the ranch went on doing what it had always done, existing, demanding, enormous, honest, and entirely itself. The cattle reached the Laramie railhead on a Thursday, which was an ordinary Thursday in every respect except that it was the day the note got paid. Wade sent the telegraph confirmation to Hatcher's office in Cheyenne the same afternoon. The lawyer filed the discharge with the bank by end of business. Hatcher's brief confirming letter arrived at the ranch 4 days later, and Evelyn read it at the kitchen table and then set it down and sat with it for a moment before Wade came in. When he did, she slid it across the table without comment. He read it. He set it down. He looked at it the way a man looks at the end of a thing he has been carrying for a long time. Not with joy, exactly, because joy implies surprise. And he had been working toward this with enough deliberate effort that the outcome was not a surprise. What it was relief. The particular exhausted relief of a weight that has been present long enough that you stopped noticing the weight and only noticed its absence when it lifted. It's done, he said. It's done, she agreed. He picked up the letter and folded it and put it in the chest pocket where important things went. Then he sat down and she poured coffee, and they drank it in the quiet that had become, over these months, the most natural thing between them. Mercer made one more move. She had expected it, had told Wade she expected it, and still it came from a direction she had not fully anticipated. Not through the bank, not through the water agreement. Those paths were closed, and Mercer was too precise a man to push a door that was clearly locked. He came instead through the county land office in Cheyenne, filing a challenge to the water rights registration on a technical ground, that the description of the tributary boundaries in the Callahan filing contained an ambiguity that rendered the registered claim legally incomplete. Hatcher's letter about this arrived the second week of March, and when Evelyn read it, she sat very still for a moment and then read it again. The technical challenge was not frivolous. There was a genuine ambiguity in the boundary description. She had not known enough about the filing process to catch it, and apparently the county clerk had not either. If Mercer pursued it and a judge agreed, the registration could be sent back for refiling, and during that window the registered status would be uncertain. She wrote to Hatcher the same day. She asked 2 questions. How long would a challenge proceeding take? And what would it cost to file a corrected description proactively before the challenge was heard? Hatcher wrote back in 5 days. A challenge proceeding would take 4 to 8 months. A corrected filing, if done immediately, would moot the challenge because the ambiguity would no longer exist. The cost was a filing fee and Hatcher's time. She showed this to Wade over supper. He read it. He's trying to run out the clock, Wade said. Get the registration into legal uncertainty long enough to collect signatures on the water agreement from the people who haven't registered. Yes, she said, but the corrected filing closes that. She looked at him. It has to be done in Cheyenne. In person, the clerk told Hatcher. I'll go, Wade said. We'll go, she said. I wrote the original boundary description. I should correct it. He looked at her for a moment. He did not argue. They went to Cheyenne the following week, 3 days' travel, and they sat with Hatcher in his office on the second day and corrected the filing together, Evelyn providing the precise language and Hatcher reviewing it, and the 3 of them going through it word by word until the description was unambiguous. They filed it that afternoon at the county land office, with a clerk who was efficient and unhurried and had no idea, Evelyn reflected, that the document she was stamping represented the termination of Douglas Mercer's scheme for the Harlow Creek Valley water. The corrected filing was on record by 4 o'clock. Mercer's challenge, when it was heard 2 months later, was dismissed. The ambiguity it cited no longer existed in the registration. There was nothing to challenge. Hatcher wrote to inform them of the dismissal in his customary brief style. He added one sentence at the bottom that he had not added to any previous letter. It had been a pleasure working with them both. Evelyn read that sentence twice. Coming from Hatcher, she understood it to be the equivalent of a standing ovation. Douglas Mercer did not disappear from the valley. Men like him rarely disappeared, but he retracted the way a hand retracts from a stove, not slowly, but immediately, once the calculation changed. His water agreement collected 3 signatures from smaller operations further down the valley who had not registered their rights and did not fully understand what they had signed. It did not collect enough to function as he had designed it to function, and without the land company holding valley land, the permanent signatory clause remained legally vulnerable, which Hatcher made sure was on record in Cheyenne through the appropriate channels. Mercer was still in Harlow Creek. He still managed the land company. But the North Pasture was not his. The water rights were registered and corrected and defensible, and the coalition he had been building quietly for 2 years had stopped growing. Some things, Evelyn had observed, didn't need to be defeated dramatically. They just needed to be made not worth continuing. Tom Whitfield told them, at a Sunday supper at the Callahan Ranch in May, that Mercer had been in conversation with a land company in Montana. Tom said this with the comfortable directness of a man delivering information he found satisfying. Montana, Wade said. Apparently there are opportunities there, Tom said. Evelyn passed the bread. There usually are, she said, for a man looking for them. Claire caught her eye across the table and said nothing, which was as good as a full sentence. Spring came to the valley the way it always came. Not gently, not all at once, but in argument with winter, gaining ground and losing it, and gaining it back. The barn roof was done by the end of April, the new cedar shingles pale against the old wood of the walls. The well casing on the east side was replaced by a man from Laramie who arrived on a Tuesday and finished by Thursday and charged fairly and did good work, which Evelyn noted for future reference. The north fence received its proper post-work over 3 weeks in March and April, with the extra hand Wade had written to, a man named Briggs, quiet and reliable, who proved so useful during the roundup that Wade asked him to stay through the summer. Briggs said yes. He stayed through the summer and the following winter and, as far as anyone could later establish, never actually left. The herd, reduced by 42 head in February, rebuilt through the spring calving season. Not fully. 2 good seasons, Wade had said, and he was right, and the first season produced what it produced, and they worked with it. The prices from the Norris buyers had been enough to clear the note and begin the repairs, but there was no surplus. Not really. Not yet. They operated on the margins of what was needed, which was the ordinary condition of ranching in this country, and had been since before either of them arrived at it. What changed, incrementally, was everything else. Gus saw a doctor in June, about the shoulder. The doctor told him what Evelyn had suspected, and Gus had been avoiding knowing. The joint had sustained damage that was not going to improve without rest, and rest was not something Gus was constitutionally capable of. They negotiated this together, Evelyn, Gus, and the stubbornness of a 22-year ranch hand, and arrived at a modified arrangement in which Gus did the work that did not require heavy lifting, and Briggs covered the rest. Gus received this outcome with the dignity of a man who had been outmaneuvered by someone he respected, which was the only form of losing he could tolerate. Mrs. Aldrich at the general store warmed by degrees, the way the valley warmed. Not all at once, but persistently, until one morning in April she asked Evelyn, unprompted, what she had used on the biscuits that the Whitfields had mentioned at the last community gathering. Evelyn told her. Mrs. Aldrich nodded and said she'd thought as much. They did not become friends immediately, and perhaps never became friends in the way that word usually implied. But they became something, the particular relationship of 2 practical women in a small place who have taken each other's measure and found it adequate. It was not nothing. By the fall, Callahan Ranch was different in ways that were visible and ways that were not. Visibly. The barn had a new roof, the east fence was tight, The ledger showed numbers that were still careful, but were moving in the right direction. There were curtains on the kitchen windows, which Evelyn had made from fabric she ordered from Laramie in the spring. Not decorative curtains, practical ones, but the kind of practical that also had some thought to it. There was a garden behind the house where she had put in winter vegetables in September, the first attempt, imperfect, producing enough to be worthwhile. Not visibly, the quality of the house itself, which was the hardest thing to describe and the most real. The difference between a house where someone lives and a house where someone exists. Wade had been existing. He was living now. And the change was in the way he moved through the rooms, the way he sat at the kitchen table in the evenings without the quality of a man waiting for something unpleasant to arrive. The laugh that had been occasional in the winter came more often in the fall. Still brief, still low, still belonging to a man who was not extravagant about anything, but present. Present in the house. She thought sometimes about what it had cost him to get there. 3 years of solitude, of deliberate shrinking away from the space that Margaret's absence had left. She did not try to fill that space and had never tried to. She had simply occupied the space she was in, done the work that was there, and let the rest move at whatever pace it moved. There was no heroism in it. It was just the only approach that made sense for two people who were both, in their own ways, cautious about the distance between what they hoped and what they said. She thought sometimes about Arthur Hale, in the impartial way you think about someone who was a catalyst rather than a person. He had failed her completely. He had also, in failing her, deposited her on a train platform in Wyoming in the dark, which was the only reason she was standing in this kitchen with these curtains in these windows, watching this man pour coffee in the particular unhurried way he poured coffee. She could not be grateful to Arthur Hale for his failure, but she could observe that the failure had landed her somewhere she would not have found otherwise, and she could let that be what it was without needing to call it anything larger. That was the thing she had learned out here, perhaps the most honest thing, that life does not follow the routes you plan for it. And the appropriate response to that is not optimism or resignation, but attention. Pay attention to what is actually in front of you. Do the work that is actually there. Stay in the room you are in rather than the room you expected to be in. It sounds simple, stated plainly. It is not simple. Most people spend enormous energy trying to inhabit the version of their life that didn't happen instead of the one that did. She had spent some energy that way herself. She was spending less of it now. On a morning in October, 1 year, almost exactly, from the night she had sat on her suitcase on the Harlow Creek platform, Evelyn walked out to the north fence. She did this alone, in the early part of the morning before the day's work started. She walked the fence line in the cold, clear air, checking the posts the way she had seen Wade check them, pressing each one with both hands, noting which ones had shifted in the first frost and which were solid. She was not doing it because she was asked to. She was doing it because it was the kind of thing that needed doing, and she had learned, over the course of a year, which things those were and when they needed doing and how to do them well enough. She reached the northeast corner where the fence met the boundary of the Whitfield land, and she stopped and looked at the valley from there. The aspens had gone gold and were starting to shed, and the valley floor was patchwork, gold and green and the dark gray of the sage. And the mountains beyond it were already showing white at the top, where the first real winter snow had come and not gone. It was large. It was always large. She had stopped being surprised by the size of it and started being, instead, grateful for it. The particular gratitude of someone who needed more space than they had ever been given and had finally been given enough. Wade found her there 20 minutes later. He did not say anything about finding her at the fence corner rather than in the kitchen. He stood beside her and looked at the valley. "The north post by the creek bend," she said. "It needs attention before the ground freezes." "I saw it yesterday," he said. "Briggs will get to it today." She nodded. They stood for a moment in the cold, which was the kind of cold that had become familiar. The Wyoming cold. The cold that was simply the condition of the place and not a problem to be solved, but a fact to be dressed for and worked within. She had the right coat now. A proper one, bought in Laramie in September, built for this country. 1 year, Wade said. He said it the way he said things, not as a sentimental observation, just as a fact being acknowledged. 1 year, she said. He was quiet. Then he said, "You know what Gus said to me this morning?" "What?" He said, The ranch is different. She looked at the valley. What did you say? I said, I know. She said nothing. The wind moved through the aspens along the creek, and the gold leaves turned in it, and some of them let go and fell. He's right, Wade said. It is different. Better? She said. She asked it directly because she was a direct person, and because the question mattered and there was no point in dressing it up. He looked at her. Yes, he said. Better. She turned back to the valley. Below them, the ranch was beginning its day. Briggs moving toward the barn, Fenwick somewhere with the sound of his tools, smoke coming from the kitchen chimney where the morning fire was going. All of it ordinary. All of it, she thought, exactly what she had come looking for in a form she would never have recognized in advance. That was the honest truth of it, the human truth, the thing that no letter of advertisement could have told her and no plan could have prepared her for. That belonging is not a place you find. It is a condition you build, slowly, out of showing up and doing the work and staying when it gets difficult and learning the sounds a place makes at night until they become the sounds of home. It cannot be arranged in advance. It cannot be promised in 17 letters. It can only be made, day by day, in the particular and unglamorous way that anything real is made. She had made this. They had made this. Not perfectly. The ledger still required careful watching. Gus's shoulder would always be a problem, and there would be dry years and difficult winters and things she could not yet predict. Not perfectly, and not easily, and not at all in the way she had planned when she stepped onto a train in Philadelphia with a suitcase and someone else's promise. But real. Completely, stubbornly, undeniably real. Come in for breakfast, she said. Briggs needs to eat before he gets to that post. I know, Wade said. They walked back to the house together in the cold morning, and behind them the north fence stood in the pale autumn light, and the valley held its shape, and the mountains sat where they had always sat, patient, enormous, entirely indifferent to the small human story that had just quietly, on this particular piece of ground, found its way to something that would last.